I think it's really interesting to hear the gentle lady from Georgia speak about Hunter Biden leaving, and she is the person that showed nude photos of Hunter Biden in this very committee room, showing dick pics in this committee room of Hunter Biden. I have my 5 minutes, gentle lady, and so I think it's really ironic, hypocritical, quite shameful that the person who's complaining about somebody leaving, when she's showing nude photos of him to this committee, showing nude photos of him to this committee in this very room. And you also talk about decorum. You're talking about January 6th. Ms. Green, I was there with you when we went to the January 6th jail, and when you were hugging, high-fiving, talking to and providing so much comfort and joy to the insurrectionists that attacked our Capitol. And you, insurrectionists that attacked our Capitol, you were hugging and giving them all the support.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman has the time.
Stop the clock. Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia.
I'd like to continue my
3 minutes and 50 seconds.
My 5 minutes. And I just want to remind everyone, that this is, again, about the Donald Trump revenge show. We're here today, and the majority is doing this hearing because this is all about Donald Trump and trying to make sure they do everything they can to support him. For weeks, we as Democrats and Republicans and the chairman demanded a public hearing, and I agree with Mr. Moskowitz. Yet, Mr. Chairman, you have denied it. We want a public hearing. If we need to take a vote or ask unanimous consent, we should hear from Mr. Biden today. That's what the public demands. Democrats are united. We like to see the same thing. And I'd like to see a vote to actually have Hunter Biden actually, with unanimous consent, do actually a hearing and address us today, if possible.
Would my friend yield?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Biden showed up.
Gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Garcia. You're up. Are you ready, or you want to go ahead with somebody else? Okay. Recognize Mr. Garcia for his 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to reiterate that it's been said this very many times today by our colleagues here on the House side, on the Democratic side, that we all know that this impeachment inquiry, this effort to try to impeach the Secretary is a complete political stunt and sham, and I just want to reiterate that. We all know it's a political ploy that's not grounded in the facts, truth, and has been conjured up for just one simple purpose, and that's to score cheap political points against the Biden administration. We also know that we've had articles from the New York Times and other publications just really laying out that this is all about this pursuit of impeaching Mayorkas. It's about this kind of effort that's been started, quite frankly, by even a member of this committee for many, many, many months. That's all just really about hurting the president. Now, Professor Bowman, Republican leaders have been quoted promising donors that they would impeach Secretary Mayorkas in fundraisers back in April of 2023. Do you believe that this committee has uncovered any evidence of high crimes or misdemeanors since that time?
Not that I'm aware of.
And thank you. And let's be clear. What we're moving ahead with today is because extremists, including some folks that are in this committee, have demanded it over and over again. Now, I want to give a couple quotes from some members of the House. Congressman Andy Biggs told Newsmax that Republicans, quote, have nothing to campaign on. And he said that he was embarrassed by this. Now, Congressman Chip Roy has said, and I want to quote, I want my Republican colleagues to give me one thing, one that I can go to campaign on to say that we did. Just one, end quote. And in fact, this last Monday, he went on TV to call the Republican conference, and I quote, a continued failure theater, end quote. So I understand that we're trying to throw red meat to an extremist base, but we're wasting the public's time, and we know that the Senate will laugh off all of these charges. And let's remember the bigger picture. Some of my friends on the other side of the aisle don't want to really govern. They're not serious about solutions that could actually become law. And they're obstructing $14 billion in emergency supplemental funding. They voted against hiring hundreds of additional Border Patrol agents and of ports of entry, and have opposed the incredible resources that we've been trying to send around technology, supporting organizations on the ground, support for Border Patrol agents, and many other types of funding. And I also want to remind the committee and the public that President Biden, on his first day in office, sent a comprehensive immigration plan to Congress, which Republicans have refused to act on. I also want to note that Secretary Mayorkas has continued to try to negotiate a bipartisan, sensible, and humane approach to actually fixing our immigration system and trying to actually address the issues that remain along the border. Because Democrats agree there are issues and challenges along the border, and we want to see those fixed. You know, as an immigrant myself, I've always believed this is a nation of immigrants. We should never forget that this country was based on so much hard work and labor of immigrants that now live all across this country. And our immigration system won't be fixed by this impeachment process, and it certainly won't be fixed by their proposal, which is H.R. 2. And let's set the record straight about H.R. 2. The bill would end Health and Human Services funding for legal representation of unaccompanied children in immigration proceedings. It would essentially send children to detention camps, and the bill subjects all unaccompanied children to an accelerated removal process, as we know, in horrible conditions at these facilities that we have seen over the last few years. And quite frankly, we know this is not just not a solution, but it's inhumane and cruel to demonize some of the most vulnerable people that are coming to our country. We want to address the root causes of migration. We want to ensure that legal pathways are followed. We want to make sure that folks receive the support they need back in their home countries. And we certainly don't want to defund organizations like Catholic Charities that would rip away aid to communities and to migrants across our country and along our border. The idea that our border problems, which have needed a bipartisan solution for decades, would be solved by H.R. 2 is just not true. It's an anti-immigrant policy, and we should reject it. Thank you, and I yield back.
The amendment in the nature of a substitute as offered by Mr. Garcia of California.
Okay, without objection, the amendment is considered as read. I reserve a point of order. Mr. Garcia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know, obviously, what we're seeing today has been quite insane. We've seen pornographic images. We've talked about white privilege. But what we haven't seen is any sort of evidence linking President Biden to any sort of wrongdoing. There's been absolutely zero evidence discussed today. And as we know, all the demands for a public hearing with Hunter have gone unanswered, even today when we asked for that vote. But what we do have is plenty of evidence that we've uncovered in this committee and that have been against the Constitution with our investigation of foreign government payments to President Trump through his businesses. And what do we have as Democrats? We have receipts, proof, a timeline, screenshots. We have everything we need to prove conclusively that foreign governments were funneling money through Trump properties and into Donald Trump's pockets, all in violation of the Constitution. Now, we don't have access to all of Trump's properties, and he has hundreds, by the way, of properties and business interests. And we don't have access because our chairman actually chose to end that investigation. But my amendment will fix that by demanding a full accounting of Trump's businesses. Now, we know that we can already prove about almost $8 million of foreign payments, illegal payments against the Constitution back to the Trump organization. And that is just a tip of the iceberg, because we don't have access to the other hundreds of businesses and properties. That $8 million of receipts and payments that we have is only from a total of 4 properties of the hundreds of businesses of Donald Trump and his family. No family in history has ever benefited more than the Trumps and the Kushners. And I actually want to talk about Jared over here especially, his son-in-law. His son-in-law was brought in to run Middle East policy at the start of the Trump White House. By the way, having zero experience in doing that work, and against the objections of his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Trump and Kushner, of course, made their first state visit to Saudi Arabia, overruling the State Department. This is the same time, by the way, that Jared was actually putting together a $110 billion arms deal for the Saudis. But what was happening during that time? The Saudis were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in room stays foreign gifts that were illegal under the Constitution back into the Trump organization. Over and over, through hotels and properties, these shady investments by the president, his sons, and his son-in-law, who was an employee of the White House, all worked to enrich the Trump family and Donald Trump himself. And the insane part is that just months after leaving the White House, Jared Kushner received a $2 billion with a B investment fund from the Saudis to manage and being paid directly as well out of that fund that the Saudi government organized. I want to just mention also that our chairman also said, and I quote, that this crossed the line of ethics, end quote. So why have we not investigated the Trump crime family and the current and ongoing abuse by Jared Kushner as a government official? And I remind folks, Hunter actually never worked for the government. He was a private citizen. That's why I want to offer my amendment, which lays out the details of not just the $8 million in illegal, unconstitutional foreign payments, but also demands Donald Trump to pay back the taxpayers. It demands a full accounting of all of his properties, and it subpoenas the Kushner businesses so we can understand the complete grift, not just from Saudi Arabia, but the 20 other foreign governments which we have records for, and the governments that we don't have records for, like places like Russia, which we know there was a series of investments made there as well. And so with that, I urge support for this amendment.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama.
And I'll just be honest, and I am a bit dismayed and disappointed to be here at this hearing today. Back in March, we held a hearing called Ensuring Forced Readiness, Examining Progressivism's Impact on an All-Volunteer Military. And back then in March, I was dismayed that the majority chose to ignore what I believe are the root causes and challenges we're facing to recruitment and retention in our armed services, such as the need for improved mental health support for our service members, the continued need to implement the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act and the need to crack down on sexual violence, the need for reliable and affordable child care for our warfighters who are deployed on a moment's notice, and so much more, especially when our economy is creating record numbers of jobs in the private sector and our military has to compete for top talent. Now, data and evidence show that sexual assault, mental health care, affordable child care are all real factors that affect military recruitment, retention, and readiness. During that hearing, many of us stressed that to recruit from the most diverse generation in history, we also need a military that looks like America. We need a cohesive military which does not allow bigotry within its ranks. But the hearing also found that attacks on military leaders and family hardships may be significant factors in dissuading otherwise motivated young people from pursuing military careers and, of course, depriving our country of incredible talent. The idea that, quote, wokeness is a top national security threat did not make any sense then and does not make any sense today. And it makes even less sense now given the world that we face. Now, I believe that overemphasis on this far-right talking point is what inspired Senator Tommy Tuberville to launch his unprecedented blockade of military officer promotions. Now, Senator Tuberville intentionally blocked more than 400 general and flag officers within the DoD from Senate confirmation and promotion. Even more junior officers lost the opportunity to rise in rank, with massive impacts on factors such as retention, pay, pension, and future opportunities. The stunt did far, far more to undermine our military readiness than anything else. And so I asked unanimous consent to enter into the record once again the letter I sent calling for a hearing on national security implications of the Senator's blockade of military promotions into the record. Thank you, sir. Now, I can't really understand why we're also holding a second hearing on this topic when we could be working on in a bipartisan way to address real challenges to our national security. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for our bipartisan work on our UAP disclosure bill. And I think that's the kind of bipartisan effort that we should be working on today. We should also be talking about our real national security threats. Our allies in Ukraine need immediate aid. We need to support Taiwan and provide aid, of course, in the Middle East. Now, we could hold hearings that use data and evidence to demonstrate that Americans' aid boosts our national security at minimal cost and highlight how our aid safeguards democracy and freedom against brutal aggressions. We could even show how Ukraine aid directly benefits communities all across our country who benefit from investment and jobs, and drive how these investments will uphold our national security in the long term. But instead, we're holding Ukraine and other crucial foreign aid hostage. Instead, many are debating that we bring back indefinite detention for children at the border, defund Catholic charities, and end the right to asylum, linking that to aid that impacts our national security. Some also appear to be using Putin's talking points that want to sell out our allies and partners. There's obstruction, of course, around issues around the border, saying that we don't want bipartisan border security actions. And one of our congressional colleagues even said the quiet part out loud, and I'll quote, "Let me tell you, I'm not willing to do a damn thing right now to help a Democrat or to help Joe Biden's approval ratings." That's not the type of bipartisan work that we need on this issue. And yet here we are investigating wokeness. Now, it's not wokeness that is threatening our national security, whatever that word actually means. The real threat to our security is a far-right extreme obstruction of dysfunction and culture war stunts. This hearing is disappointing, but I look forward to working with our chairman and hope there can be bipartisan solutions. I yield back.
Gentleman, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses that are here today. And I obviously am hearing a lot of conversation that we hear over and over again at these many border hearings, not just here, but in Homeland Security. I want to remind everyone that just this week we saw the Republican Party nominate an insurrectionist, an indicted criminal, and a grifter who has accepted millions of dollars from foreign governments as their nominee for president, and that nomination rolls on. Now, as an immigrant myself, what's been the most offensive to me about Donald Trump is his disgusting rhetoric about immigrants. The man who entered politics by calling Mexicans rapists and trying to ban Muslims from entering this country is still spreading hatred today. Donald Trump has said that immigrants, and I quote, are poisoning the blood of our country, end quote. And I think it's important to remind ourselves of how horrific those words are. Now, this kind of rhetoric we hear all the time from Donald Trump, which we know also relates to something that Hitler once said. And our extremists here in Congress continue to parrot Donald Trump and his attacks on migrants and immigrants. We all want an orderly and safe border, but the idea here that we can have a serious conversation about the border is insane. Now, Mr. Beer, it's good to see you again, and I want to thank you for your testimony. And if you don't mind, I'd like to get your thoughts on some potential border solutions that we've actually heard a few times. Here I have a poster, and if you see it, it's got these alligators on a moat, and they're at the border, and this one's got a little hat. Do you think it'd be a good idea to build a water-filled trench filled with alligators along the border?
That would be a misuse of taxpayer dollars and extremely inhumane.
So you think it would be inhumane to build a moat, put alligators in them along the border? That would not be a good idea.
No.
What if we instead ordered soldiers to shoot migrants in the legs and stop them from coming to the U.S.? Would that be a good idea?
No, that would be attempted murder.
What about the wall that Trump, of course, was building? Would it be better instead if we electrified it and put spikes at the top of the wall?
That would dramatically increase the cost that Border Patrol would incur. We've already seen how Border Patrol's wall has caused so many more injuries. They have taken millions of dollars to care for the people who have suffered injuries falling from that wall.
And Mr. Beer, what if instead we launched military strikes against targets in northern Mexico? Would that make the border, you think, more or less secure?
It would make it less secure. Creating a crisis in Mexico would probably be the best thing you could do to increase illegal immigration.
I only ask you all these questions because these are all proposals by the Republican frontrunner for the nomination, Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump. Every single one of these ideas, alligator moats, missiles into Mexico, shooting migrants in the legs, putting spikes on top of the wall. These are all the ideas on how to make our border system and our immigration system more fair, according to Donald Trump. So obviously Donald Trump has no idea what he's talking about, and it's over and over we're seeing these horrific ideas. Now, Mr. Beer, do you think it's even possible to secure the border through force or deterrence alone, as some of my colleagues are suggesting?
No, absolutely not. We've had an experiment with this for the last 50 years. We've had very high levels of illegal immigration. punctuated by periods of job depression in the United States, economic downturns, do help secure the border. They talked about the most secure border in 45 years. April 2020 is not a good sample size. That's not a great way to secure the border, destroying the U.S. economy.
That's exactly right, Mr. Beer. And a lot of people want to come to the U.S. through legal pathways. I'm an immigrant myself. I came here as a young child, became a citizen in my early 20s. It's hard to become a U.S. citizen. But this is one of my favorite graphs here. This actually shows you our current immigration system, what the current legal pathway system looks like. Does this seem like an easy immigration system we have for someone to actually navigate through?
No, less than 3% of people who attempt that process get through it every year.
So this system, you would say, just looking at it, looks rather complex, is probably not easy to navigate for someone seeking a legal asylum or a process here. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Everybody, almost everyone needs an attorney in order to navigate this type of process.
And I will tell you that as someone that tried to navigate this system back here, being cheated on by numerous attorneys, cheated my family, stole money, woke up at 4 in the morning to get in lines that we were never seen at different offices. We haven't had comprehensive immigration reform in this country in 30+ years. It's been a failure of this Congress, and if the Republicans really wanted solutions, would actually work on fixing this system here versus the attacks on immigrants and Donald Trump's insane ideas. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. The chair now.
Thank you.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. Want to just get back to where we're here. This is, of course, another effort, and this hearing is really about demonizing migrants and, again, smearing Secretary Mayorkas. Professor Perlstein, thank you for being here. Are there any grounds, again, for impeaching Secretary Mayorkas under the Constitution?
I don't believe the Constitution supports impeachment in this case.
Thank you. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the most important question and really gets to the heart of why we're here today. We talked a lot about the fentanyl crisis and fentanyl in this committee and today, but the fentanyl crisis we know is a tragedy. But we also, it's important to remember who didn't end the fentanyl crisis. That was actually Donald Trump. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to introduce this article titled Synthetic Opioid Overdose Deaths Soared While Trump Was President. I also would like to, into the record, put this other article, Opioid Crisis, Critics Say Trump Fumbled Response to Another Deadly Epidemic. And I bring these documents up because I think it's really important to note that during Trump's presidency, the fentanyl crisis had already been a huge challenge across this country. In fact, Trump said before the 2016 election, he said the opioid crisis was destroying lives and shattering families. And he said, quote, "We are going to stop the inflow of drugs into New Hampshire and into our country 100%. 100%. Trump promised. In 2017, Trump's first year in office, more than 42,000 Americans died from overdoses linked to heroin, fentanyl, and prescription opioids. So there was a huge fentanyl problem when Donald Trump was president. The administration didn't even bother to issue a national strategy on fentanyl in his first 2 years in office. So I think it's crazy that the majority is trying to turn this into a public health crisis that somehow new or began during the Biden administration. Unfortunately, this is about much larger issues that we have, because our conversation today isn't about the Constitution or the law. It's not even about securing the border. The majority is not interested in solutions. Donald Trump, as always, has said the quiet part out loud when he said immigrants, and I quote, are poisoning the blood of our country. As we know, this is rhetoric that can be compared to Hitler and the kind of rhetoric that he used. Extremists here in Congress also continue to push issues like the Great Replacement theory. And we should be clear, immigrants are some of the most patriotic and hardworking people there are in this country. I just heard a committee member say, and I quote, that they are not prepared to be assimilated, talking about immigrants. I'm an immigrant. I think I'm pretty well assimilated here. I am a member of Congress. And so I think it's very un-American to attack and demonize migrants the way that some in this majority continue to do. Immigrants aren't here to poison or victimize the American people. I also want to just touch on this issue of crime. Some in the majority continue to talk about crime, and crime is a horrific tragedy. Clearly, I feel horrible for our witnesses that are here that have lost members of their family. But let's look at real data as well. Both undocumented and documented immigrants are much less likely to commit crimes or be incarcerated than native-born American citizens. Our border communities are often safer from violent crimes than many interior cities. And according to FBI crime data, crime in border communities was measured to actually be 15% lower than the national average. So from a crime perspective, more crime is being committed by American citizens than those folks that are undocumented or that are immigrants. Democrats also want an orderly and secure border. We want real solutions to the fentanyl crisis, but we need to understand the problems we're trying to solve need solutions, legislation, not impeachments of the secretary, and certainly not impeachments of President Biden. The idea that any of these problems will be solved by the border alone, I think, is also crazy. These problems have existed for decades. We haven't had immigration reform or any sort of policy in over 30 years. And without legal pathways, we will never have an orderly border. That is also a fact. And we can't have a conversation with a presidential candidate, a former president, who thinks immigrants are poisoning the blood of our nation, who thinks that we should build a moat with alligators along the border, who thinks that we should put spikes on the wall that he's trying to build, who has said that we should shoot migrants in the legs as they're crossing the border, who thinks we should send missiles into northern Mexico. These are the ideas being offered by the likely nominee of the Republican Party and by many on this committee and in the Republican majority. We need to have real solutions. We don't need Donald Trump's horrific policies to come back to this country, and we certainly shouldn't be impeaching Secretary Mayorkas. And with that, I yield back.
I'll recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of comment on the amendment and the nature of the substitute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we should certainly, I think, be embarrassed to be here today. This is a complete sham impeachment. I also like to point out that the previous speaker on this committee has been spending a lot of her time actually fundraising off of this impeachment effort, and so the fact that she's posturing to taking it seriously, I think, is quite a joke as well. Now, in this Congress, which is the least productive that we've had, as we all know, since the 1930s, we've only passed 23 laws, and most of those, of course, have been generally terrible laws. But when the extreme majority cannot pass laws, they resort to political stunts and stunt impeachments, the one against the president, and certainly the one here today. Now, we have heard over and over from constitutional scholars, including Republicans, that there's no basis for this impeachment. And I want to take a moment to correct the record on a couple things. I've heard my Republican colleagues claim that Trump secured the border and somehow President Biden opened it. Let's be clear and review the facts. The spike in migration started under Donald Trump. Border Patrol apprehensions actually tripled in the last 8 months of the Trump presidency, rising from more than 21,000 in May 2020 to over 71,000 that December as he was leaving office. So the migration spike started under Donald Trump, and we should make that very clear. Now, today, Secretary Mayorkas is also dealing with the fallout of historic crises happening across Latin America. Venezuela has completely collapsed and is in crisis. Ecuador is dealing with a historic gang crisis. Cuba and Haiti are also facing enormous challenges as well. The whole region is struggling to recover from extreme weather, droughts, and COVID-19. Meanwhile, a historic economic recovery in the U.S. has created a demand for workers. Now, all of this impacts the border. But we know that's not all. The majority blames Secretary Mayorkas for his policies for the surge of people coming here to seek asylum, but they won't accept any legislative proposals or funding to deal with the problem when the president and the secretary offer them. Speaker Johnson has told Fox News multiple occasions now that he's taking his orders from Trump on the border. And he just said recently, as of today, that he won't even take up the Senate deal. Donald Trump speaks about immigrants with the same rhetoric that Hitler did, claiming that immigrants like me and my family, and I quote, pollute the blood of this country. He wants chaos, and he's admitted he even would like to see a recession happening this year. But I want to remind the public and the majority that Donald Trump...
Will the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I want to remind the public that Donald Trump and House Republicans also have their own ideas for the border. So let's review the majority's border ideas that they've actually presented. Here they are. Donald Trump actually has said that he wants to build alligator moats along the border. That's one of his incredible ideas. Another idea that Donald Trump has promoted is he actually wants to electrify the border fence and maybe even put some spikes on the border. That's another Donald Trump and MAGA majority border idea. Another idea, which I'm not sure how well it would go, is he wants to actually bomb northern Mexico with missiles. That's another Trump idea. And finally, I think one of the ones that I think is the most grotesque is suggestions that instead we should maybe just shoot migrants in the legs as they cross the border. So once again, the Donald Trump and MAGA plan is alligator moats, bombing northern Mexico, shooting migrants in the legs, and electrifying the fence and putting spikes on them. That is the Donald Trump border plan. And so again, we are here today with these horrific ideas being presented constantly by the former president. This is all about trying to get Donald Trump reelected. Donald Trump himself is saying he wants no solutions this year out of the Congress, and Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden continue to offer solutions every day and are ready to actually talk about real immigration and border solutions in this country. And with that, I yield
Mr.
back.
Garcia, will you yield for a clarifying question?
Sure.
Can you clarify what you mean by the analogy that you just said that Donald Trump was Hitler?
Well, when you say that you want to pollute when immigrants are polluting this country, that to me and the blood of this country, that is absolutely reminiscent of things that Adolf Hitler said. And in fact, his imagery, the way he supports white nationalism, the way he supports white supremacy, and those kind of comments are completely offensive to immigrants and hopefully to all Americans in this country.
So just to be clear, you were drawing an analogy between Donald Trump saying he is like Hitler.
I'm drawing an analogy that the rhetoric that Donald Trump uses is very much the rhetoric and the type of rhetoric that Adolf Hitler used.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes of discussion on the amendment and the nature of a substitute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's a sad day that we're here. I don't think anybody takes any pleasure in being here. In fact, this is really the last resort that our founders intended to use an impeachment as a check and a balance. I personally have wrestled with the appropriate congressional response to what has been a willful refusal to comply with the law, to adhere to congressional directives, and more importantly, to secure a homeland. The failure to secure the border has been so significant, so catastrophic, so egregious that Congress must now use its power to provide accountability. And we must be the check and the balance against such an extremely egregious breach of the public trust. You know, families around the country have lost confidence in the secretary, in the government, in the administration. I show you this picture right here of the Tambunga family. This is a button that the Tambungas sat right there when Secretary Mayorkas was testifying. The 71-year-old grandmother was killed. The 7-year-old granddaughter was killed by a human trafficker doing 100 miles an hour in West Texas, carrying 11 illegal aliens, evading capture, and tragically slammed into their vehicle, instantly killing them. For Maria and Amelia's sake, if not this effort, then what? She sat, the daughter of Maria sat with Secretary Mayorkas and said, this is not political, we want you to secure the border, and yet nothing has been done. We passed H.R. 2 in May of last year. When you go to the border, when you talk to Border Patrol, when you talk to ICE agents, what they tell you is that there are no consequences, that the Secretary has willfully refused to enforce the laws that are on the books. And I asked rhetorically to the other side, if not this effort, then how do you hold accountability? Do you think that this has been a success? We offer these articles of impeachment today, a willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law, an egregious breach of public trust, because we do take seriously our oath. We do take seriously the check and the balance. There's been 3 years that the other side has had to make a change, and they haven't. And this is the last resort, which is why this is a sad day. The other side is going to say this is policy difference. No, it's not. These are not policy differences. This is a debate. This is not a debate about taxes or spending. This is a debate about following the law, which the executive branch should be doing, and yet they're not. Do you remember the 53 people that were killed in a tractor trailer south of San Antonio in July of last year? They were locked up. A smuggler left them to to rot and perish in a tractor trailer. That's what this is about. The Secretary has done nothing, has absolutely done nothing to make our country more secure. He has weakened us in every single case.
Will the gentleman yield for a quick question?
Just a couple of weeks ago, Secretary Mayorkas sat right there next to Director Wray, and I asked a question of the 300 people who have matched the terror watch list. Director Wray, are there still people at large in this country that you know match the terror watch list, but you don't know where they are? Director Wray answered, yes, there are people still at large that match the terror watch list. Secretary Mayorkas, I asked him, do you have a policy to detain people that match the terror watch list? And he would not answer in the affirmative. That's why we're here today, because he has willfully refused time and time again to enforce the laws on the books. We've given many solutions. The Senate hasn't taken them up. It's this type of behavior that brings us here.
Will the gentleman
This
yield
is
for
an
a question?
extreme position.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
No, I will not. My silence to you was the answer. The extreme position is that of my colleague completely disregarding a mother who was here just a few weeks ago that lost her kids to fentanyl. That's why we're here. I've got to think that on this other side of the aisle, that you think that this is a complete and utter failure to secure the homeland. That's why Republicans are here, and I hope that you will join in calling it out and doing the right thing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the Assistant Secretary for being here as well, and thank you for your service. I think this hearing, obviously, I'm sure it tells you, and it certainly tells us here, how pointless these House Republican investigations are that happen in this committee over and over again. These investigations into the Biden administration and our public health officials are really quite shameful. We've been at this now for almost an entire year of these hearings, and with very little to show for it. Which is why we're sitting here arguing back and forth about whether or not HHS has been responsive enough to requests for information. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to note that this is the epitome of a hearing that could have been an email. And there's no reason we need to sit here and participate in this hit job on our nation's health officials. It seems to be the case every time we have one of these hearings. If House Republicans weren't so desperate to find a shred of evidence for their members' unhinged conspiracies, they could be using this time and resources to actually save lives and prevent the next pandemic. But the majority is not interested in any of that. They're only interested in forcing their extreme ideology on the American people, whether it's kicking low-income families off their health insurance or gutting the right to abortion care across the country. Now, and let's also be really clear, these policies have been proposed not just by the Republican majority, but also by their Supreme Leader, Donald Trump. We know that Donald Trump has already vowed to roll back health care in this country. He's vowed to roll back women's right to reproductive health. He's vowed to appeal Obamacare. He's vowed to kick people off their health care. He's vowed to eliminate and actually destroy the way we actually have Medicare in this country. And remember, let's also remind ourselves that many of the committee folks on this committee have also spent a large part of the last decade trying to actually dismantle Obamacare and kick millions of Americans off their health insurance plans. And again, we know Donald Trump just last week said he would like to repeal Obamacare. So the point of many of these of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is essentially to kick people off health care, roll back Obamacare, attack our healthcare officials across this country, and do whatever they can to elect Donald Trump president again. And by the way, if you have a pre-existing condition, your health coverage could be gone under some of these Republicans' plans. And to that extent, before I was in Congress and certainly before I was in elected office, I was a faculty member at a university. And the attack, of course, on students and pre-existing conditions and young people having access to their parents' plan is also a consistent theme with the majority. Now, on top of this, we all know that Obamacare was critical to people's access to care during the pandemic and during the horrific period of loss of life that we had in this country. The pandemic has cost us more than 1.3 million Americans and certainly had a huge impact on my city. Can you share for my colleagues what the COVID would have looked like for the American healthcare system and the American people if Obamacare had actually been repealed as most of the majority wanted to back when they made that last attempt?
Congressman, I actually want to be forward-thinking, and what I will say is I'm very glad that the ACA was available and the marketplaces were available for as people had job loss. There was coverage options, whether that was Medicaid, COBRA, or the ACA for coverage, and the support for individuals allowed us to recover from the pandemic and the economic impact at a much more rapid pace than probably would have happened had there not been that coverage.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that's absolutely right. We should be thinking about ways to expand healthcare coverage across this country, not take health coverage away. I want to just want to note that one thing that's really discouraging is this consistent attack on public health officials, on you, on all of our witnesses that come forward. And this is the same majority that encourages skepticism, as we know, of not just and attacks on our healthcare system, but our even COVID vaccination process and vaccines in general. They've encouraged, as you know, followers on social media to ignore recommendations of doctors, to ignore vaccinations for children, comparing getting vaccines to essentially causing mass harm to the American public, which we all know is both shocking and incredibly irresponsible. During my time as mayor, getting supplies, getting vaccines, getting masks, getting PPE to the public was incredibly important. Last year I introduced the FLASH Act, which helps HHS cut through red tape and get critical medical supplies like PPE, tests, and vaccines during emergencies. Just lastly, how do you think the FLASH Act would impact HHS's ability to get these supplies?
Congressman, I don't want to speak to specific pieces of legislation, but what I can say is investments in PPE, investments in supplies, the ability to make sure people have the health care they need and the protection they need when they need it is critically important. And we are happy to work with you or any member of Congress on legislation to meet those goals.
Thank you very much. And with that, I yield back.
I do not want
an
your
excellent question.
No.
A smart question.
No, my time
An intelligent question.
You have no smart or intelligent questions.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you. That was a lot. I want to remind the gentle lady that it was her that actually organized a trip to the D.C. jail to hug and high five and sit with the insurrectionists that actually attacked our Capitol. So if we're talking about the safety of D.C. and the Capitol, it's just quite, I think, ironic. This is all facts. This is quite ironic that the insurrectionists that tried to overthrow our government in the capital city were being coddled. We're actually being coddled by. It's quite a shame that you call them political prisoners or hostages. I think maybe you called them. They actually try to overthrow our government. Let me continue with my time.
She's not recognized.
Thank you. So I think it's quite interesting that my colleague tried to talk about the safety of D.C. When she literally supported an insurrection, an attack on the Capitol, visited the prisoners. I was there as one of 2 Democrats there as part of that visit on behalf of this committee, and seeing her high five folks that want to overthrow our government. So quite ridiculous. And if she's so interested in fixing Washington, D.C., maybe she should run for mayor of D.C. It's what she seems to be interested in. She's obsessed with everything going on. I just want to remind folks that D.C. and the district has a mayor. They have a city council. They're trying to pass regulations. They're trying to work. There's definitely challenges. They're working very hard on those. And overall, let's remember that crime all across the country has actually decreased over the last couple of years. It has not increased. It's decreased. And with that, I yield back my time.
Wait, Mr. Would you yield?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your trenchant remarks, Mr. Garcia. Trying to pierce through the fog of propaganda, confusion, disinformation, and just lies that we just heard. The distinguished gentlelady, who I'd be very happy to yield some of my time to answer the question, started off by complaining about the murder rate in Washington, the carjacking in Washington, and gun violence. And the question that I wanted to pose to the gentlelady, which she anticipated as a stupid question, was simply what she thinks in this legislation that we're here to discuss 5798 will bring down the murder rate or bring down carjacking or bring down gun violence in Washington. Because the sole purpose of the legislation, as I can read it, is simply to say that the chief of police no longer has disciplinary authority over his or her own police force, but instead it will be subject to collective bargaining. Now, that might be a great policy for the gentlelady's district in Georgia. I'd be interested to know where the municipalities in her district are on that question. But in any event, the people of Washington, D.C. have dealt with this repeatedly. We've got a letter right here, which I submitted for the record, from 12 out of 13 members of the D.C. City Council saying, please don't change our law. We have the statements of 4 different chiefs of police saying, please don't change our law. We've got cops who've been convicted of sexual violence, sexual assault, domestic violence, and I'm not even certain the gentlelady from Georgia understood what she was speaking for, because she was talking about the murder rate and carjacking, and unless she's saying that police officers who may be removed from the force in D.C. for having committed a sexual assault or domestic violence are more likely to help bring down the murder rate, then her remarks are completely nonsensical. It was much ado about nothing. So thank you for allowing me to make that point. I yield back to you, Mr. Garcia.
Would the gentleman yield to a question?
Sure.
You mentioned that crime was down nationwide. Then why isn't it down in Washington, D.C.? You have any idea?
I mean, let me just say, I served as mayor of a city of 500,000 people for 8 years. Crime trends go up and down. You look at overall crime rates, you look at violent crime. Crime overall across the country has gone down. Not everywhere. There are areas of Kentucky and other places in the country that crime has gone up. But why? But if we're so focused on just D.C., then we should focus on places like Kentucky and Arkansas and Texas and other cities where crime is also slightly going up.
Well, and if the gentleman would yield on that point, there have been increases in different categories in crime in the gentlelady's own state that she represents, Georgia. If collective bargaining is the solution to that, would she support collective bargaining for public workers in Georgia? Because it's not allowed there. And she doesn't seem to understand that she just became a champion of collective bargaining and the right to organize a union. And I would invite her to come back to proclaim her new pro-union sympathies publicly for her own state as well.
We would support her on the PRO Act, actually, if you would like to vote for the PRO Act.
Gentlemen's time's expired. Do any other members wish to be recognized?
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for their testimony. Mr. Hauser, thank you for your service to our country. I'm just wondering, Mr. Hauser, is it possible for the Biden administration to improve conditions at the border if congressional Republicans continue to block the extra resources that the president has actually requested?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. Not providing the proper resources that are needed to handle the volume that we are seeing at the southern border is going to drastically decreases Border Patrol's ability, along with ICE and the agencies across the federal government that support sort of the immigration continuum and the immigration process.
Thank you. And I want to just, I think, remind the committee also that, Donald Trump has ordered Speaker Johnson essentially to block any border bill so that he could cause, of course, more chaos, in my opinion, along the border. Now, we also, we've talked about some of the former president's strategy of actually dealing with the border, whether it's been some of these crazy ideas we discussed earlier. As a reminder to everyone, the right to seek asylum is, we know, enshrined in law. And Mr. Hauser, does the Trump strategy of violence and deterrence work to stop migration?
Sir, over my time at the department, the idea that just sort of detention and deterrence and punitive measures would sort of deter migrants from seeking asylum in this country is farcical.
And without any action to address like push factors of migration.
Could you just yield for 1 second?
Am I going to keep my time?
Sure, absolutely. I just want to comment, because he's not here to defend himself. I know Mike Johnson. I know Mike Johnson since he came in the legislature before Donald Trump was president. I'm sure Mike Johnson doesn't have to wait for Donald Trump's orders to say that that bipartisan bill is inadequate. I mean, that's just a slander against him when he's not here. I'm sure he's not doing that because Donald Trump ordered him to.
I mean, I think he said so on Fox News that he was doing that, actually. That's exactly what he said. And he actually has been taking the exact direction of Donald Trump and has said so publicly in their conversations. But I'll continue. Now, without action to address push factors and legal pathways, there's also there's no possibility of an orderly and secure border. I want to also put up another quote that was recent that the former president said, which I think is telling. It says, It is only common sense that when I'm reelected, we will begin, and we have no choice, the largest deportation operation in American history. Now, Stephen Miller has said in an interview that he would target 10 million people and would, and I quote, go around the country arresting illegal immigrants in large-scale raids, unquote. This would involve, again, quote, large-scale staging grounds near the border, most likely in Texas, unquote, to serve as camps for migrants designated for deportation. Now, he outlined how this could mean sending National Guard troops from Republican-controlled states in what he called, quote, unfriendly states to conduct mass arrests. Mr. Hauser, can you explain to the American people what exactly this kind of proposal would look like and what that would actually mean?
Yes, sir. In my personal my opinion, at the sort of expulsion rates or removal rates that they're looking for, sort of the logistical transportation security apparatus, along with sort of the at-large arrests, would be dramatically taxing not only on ICE and CBP, where they're not resourced to sort of meet those levels. Additionally, pulling from other law enforcement agencies across the federal government, ATF, DEA, FBI, the burden that it would place on the national security community would be extreme. In that, you would also have to look at the fact that what would our law enforcement community not be focused on? Human smuggling, human trafficking, criminals, violent criminals, etc. I must also say that those sort of deportations and removals, as my colleagues on this panel have stated earlier, would be controlled by the receiving country receiving those mass returns and removals. And as we, yeah.
No, please continue just briefly.
That has been one of the controlling factors of ICE continuing to do its job. Yes.
And this plan, as outlined by Miller, the one you're discussing as well, would also target long-term residents who have actually not committed crimes, correct?
I have no sort of knowledge of sort of that plan, sir, but what I say at that scale, targeting long-term sort of individuals that have been in this country, if there's no disagreement that the numbers of encounters at the border are exacerbating our ICE and CBP officers.
And if this operation, would it even be legal?
I can't speak to that, sir.
Well, I don't believe so. But this is the kind of, I think, general chaos that is being discussed oftentimes in the majority that has no real solutions along the border. It does nothing to make us more safe or more secure. But we know that there actually are solutions we could focus on in a bipartisan way, but there does not seem to be any interest on that from the majority. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you. Well, I think we've learned two things. The first is that there's absolutely zero evidence linking Hunter Biden's business dealings to the president. We knew that already. And the second thing that's really important here is a reaffirmation that Republicans apparently hate parents and sons and families that talk to each other by phone often. The one thing that was relatable to a lot of us is that we learned again that, yes, of course, the president and his son have a good, warm, personal relationship, and yes, they talk by phone, and yes, they care and love each other, and that's not something the Republicans should continue to attack over and over and over again. There is zero evidence linking, again, the president to Hunter Biden's business. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, House Republicans have finally decided to have Hunter Biden testify in public on their sham impeachment into President Biden. Now, the American people will soon see what we all saw behind closed doors, that there is zero evidence of any wrongdoing by President Biden, who had no involvement in any of Hunter's business dealings. Absolutely none. And we'll continue to call out these lies. But let's take a look at the star witnesses that the House majority has brought forward in this political stunt impeachment. We have Alexander Smirnov, we know is an indicted Russian asset. He's been indicted for lying, by the way, and working with Russian spies. We have another who turned out to be a spy for China and actually sold weapons to Iran. And a third is right now serving a 14-year sentence in prison for fraud. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. We also, of course, recently have learned about another disgraced con man who colluded with the Trump campaign, all star witnesses of the Republican majority. And of course, we shouldn't forget Rudy Giuliani and his grand conspiracy theories, which is all the House majority is left with. Now, the GOP insists on impeaching President Biden at whatever the cost, all to help Donald Trump get reelected. Now, Donald Trump was impeached twice for his crimes and faces 91 felony charges, and he's desperate for revenge. If there's anyone we should be investigating, it's the Trump crime family and Jared Kushner's $2 billion deal from the Saudi government, which he received just weeks after leaving the White House. The one person that was in charge of the Middle East envoy, then receives $2 billion into an investment fund. We know that the Saudis spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in Trump properties. That is a real scandal and should be investigated. It's time to end this impeachment scam and get back to work for the American people. And with that, I yield back. Thank you all. And one last point, and then if there's a couple questions, we'll take those, and then we're going to wrap up. Something that was said earlier, the countries that we criticize, countries like Russia, countries like Iran, they are known for silencing social media companies. They're known for silencing opposition or information they don't seem to agree with. The United States cannot be in the same category as these countries that we continuously go after on issues of free speech. Part of free speech is also hearing things you may disagree with. And so you have our support, and just know that we're going to fight every single minute until this vote happens, and we are going to work to ensure that we stop this ban of TikTok. And with that, if there's a couple questions from the press, we'll go into, yes.
Hi, I'm Ashley Gold with Axios. You mentioned there was nothing in the classified briefing that made you feel like TikTok is an immediate threat or anything like that. What I hear from a lot of other lawmakers is, yes, it's true that TikTok has the same issues every other social media platform does, but there's a unique threat because ByteDance is a Chinese company, and therefore we'll always have to listen to Beijing if they have a request. So what did they say during the Intel briefing? Did they say anything specifically about that, since that's unique to TikTok? And can you share anything else about that?
I'll say two things if you want to add. Number one, we do vast majority of our U.S. trade with China. So if China want to disrupt us tomorrow, they have all the ability to do so. And so we're targeting one section of our relationship with China, which is a massive commerce relationship that we have. The second piece is we have yet to have any national security apparatus publicly produce any information that has shown that TikTok, the American company, that the affiliate, is actually taking any data and sending it over to China to impact Americans. There's no evidence of that yet. And so we have not learned any new information, and we certainly haven't heard evidence that that is actually happening. I don't know if anybody wants to add on that. Okay.
You talked about the communal benefits of this platform, but why can't you create that same sense of community on another social media platform that doesn't have the same national security risks?
Do it then. Right? I mean, it's easier said than done. And here's, look, this is to both questions really quick, is it's not that briefing didn't put concern into us. This is something we're all concerned about. We're concerned about our data. But it's that briefing didn't change our opinion on this bill. Steamrolling this bill, this is the fastest I've seen a bill go through in my year and change in Congress. I'd like to see a bill that will maybe address gun violence go that fast, and we have 100 kids dying a day to a gun. I'd love to see a bill combating the climate crisis when we're literally in the middle of an existential crisis. So I want to be clear. I'm not up here saying we're not concerned. I would like to see ownership of TikTok change. Of course, this bill is not the way to achieve what we're looking to get, because it will drastically interrupt American life for so many people, but also small businesses and content creators. And again, we can find ourselves in the same situation in 6 months to a year talking about some other social media company. Let's talk about, if you care about data privacy, whether it's a foreign actor or domestic, let's craft legislation on protecting Americans' data, period. If we do that, not only will we handle the concerns that we have with TikTok without interrupting all these small business owners and content creators, but we're also going to be able to handle the situation for the next thing and the next thing and the thing after that. So that's really what this is about. I'm not up here because I'm the Gen Z guy, first Gen Z, whatever. I'm up here because this is bad policy. And we want to make sure that we get good policy in to handle this situation for us as we grow up and our kids and from here on out.
Question, Donald Trump came out now against the ban that he used to be for. Have you talked to any of your Republican colleagues? Do you have a sense that that is helping to weaken support among Republicans for passing this bill tomorrow? Does anyone have any sense of how that's playing with the House?
Look, yeah, I mean, I don't know what, Donald Trump's opinion changes often, so it's hard to know. It might change tomorrow again. What I do know is there's bipartisan opposition to this legislation. So you have Democrats, and we're talking more by the hour, and certainly Republicans. Many Republicans who I heard just speaking up in the last hour or two that have been surprises to me, that share deep concerns. But there is a full effort right now to try to slam this bill through as fast as possible. And I agree with Maxwell. Why there isn't this urgency with so many other pressing issues is crazy. So I don't know, Del, do you want to add to that or anything?
No, I think you've said it. There's dangerous precedent. Look, I serve as vice ranking member in Homeland Security. All of us have said there are major concerns right now around people's security, people's identity. We see that all the time. The issue here is that this bill is not going to address this. 180 days turnaround is not going to get us, first of all, TikTok to be interrupted. I mean, you're talking about people's livelihood in this moment. And the fact that we have not heard from people, from community, we fast-tracked through hearings, it's dangerous precedent that we just can't allow to happen. And Congressman Garcia said it. Every day as I talk to people from last week to today, people are like, well, I was leaning yes, but I think I'm leaning no. Right. So I have to say that your calls, your stories, your personal experiences are being heard, and we want to make sure that it actually is in effect when we go and vote tomorrow.
And because people are actually taking the time to read the bill. When this first came out, it felt like it was steamroll. It's going to have 365 votes or however many members of Congress there are. As time goes by, people are reading the bill, fielding objections from stakeholders in the community, learning about the fact that this isn't a good policy to address the problem, and they're coming from being a yes to a no. I'll tell you, if this vote was postponed till next week, we'd see even more people be in opposition to it.
And one more thing, this whole idea that some folks have been complaining that somehow TikTok and creators and users are organizing to call in offices is ridiculous. Thank you for calling offices. That is actually your right to be able to call offices and organize. And people are upset because people are sharing their points of view is just wrong. We have time maybe for one or two more.
One more point on this. My colleagues are upset about these calls from the offices. What about when billionaires put billions of dollars into super PACs to impact our elections?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Yes. Last question.
Question here. Number one, do you think the bill is going to pass the House tomorrow if you're hearing more opposition? And number two, if it does pass the House, who are you working with in the Senate right now to keep the bill from moving forward there?
So one, we obviously don't know what it's going to look like. I do know that I'm not overly optimistic in a situation where there is huge forces trying to slam this thing through. However, every hour there's more and more people that I'm hearing are going to vote no. So if we keep up the pressure and keep up the conversation, I think that's really, really important. The second thing is, if this bill passes the House, I know the three of us and many others are going to do everything we can to talk to our senators and ensure the Senate does not rush on this and to do the right thing. So I'm more hopeful in the Senate doing the right thing right now than us in the House. And last question that we got to wrap up.
The TikTok CEO is reportedly in Washington right now and has plans to meet with some lawmakers, members of Congress. Have any of the lawmakers here been reached out to meet with the TikTok CEO?
I have not.
Yeah, I haven't met with him either.
Would you meet with him if he came?
Sure, I might meet with anybody.
I don't need to meet with any. I mean, I'm going to vote no.
Yeah, I'm going to vote no too.
I heard from my constituents. That's right. That's good enough for me.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us, but most importantly, I want to thank all of the TikTok creators and small business owners who are here that are fighting for their business, for their families, and for what they believe is their way to communicate to the public. So thank you all for being here. We wanted to make sure we gathered at a really important point where there might be looking like a vote tomorrow morning on what could lead to a ban on TikTok. Now, we do know for certain that it is likely that if this legislation passes, there could certainly be a disruption of service to a platform that 170 million Americans use. And that disruption could lead to a full ban. I want to introduce some folks. My name is Robert Garcia. I represent California. We're going to have 4 other members of Congress that are also going to speak, and 2 TikTok creators as well. We have Congressman Maxwell Frost, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, and Congresswoman Delia Ramirez. I want to thank them for being here. Now, I've been a fan of TikTok long before I came to Congress. It's a way to communicate. Also, as an openly gay person, it's a place where I get so much gay information, where gay creators come to share news. And long before I got to Congress, I also used TikTok to gather what was going on around me around the world, not just in politics, but also in entertainment and pop culture. We should also be honest with each other. TikTok is also fun. People use it. And 1 in 3 Americans are on TikTok in some form of another. That's 1 in 3 US adults. We know that TikTok is also a space for representation. And banning TikTok also means taking away a voice and a platform for communities of color and queer creators that have made TikTok their home. What's really important for the public to know is any ban on TikTok is not just banning the freedom of expression. You are literally causing huge harm to our national economy. We have small business owners that are here and small business owners from across the country that use TikTok to move our economy forward. Some of these creators and these business owners solely depend on TikTok for their revenue and their job. And so to rush a process forward that could ban their form of work, particularly young people in this country, is misguided and it's rush. We also believe that singling out TikTok is not fair. Now, we all need to be honest about the dangers of social media, and we understand those. Is there disinformation on TikTok? Absolutely. Is there also disinformation on Meta, on Instagram, on X? Absolutely. All of our social media platforms need to be treated equally and need to be treated the same way. And to single out TikTok in this way, we believe is dangerous and certainly against freedom of expression. We need to take a better approach to these social issues, and I personally believe that the movement to hopefully stop this bill and get more votes continues to grow. Before I turn this over to Congressman Frost, I want to say one last thing. A lot of us attended a classified briefing today on TikTok from a national security perspective. My opinion going into the briefing was to not support a ban, but I wanted to hear the information. My opinion leaving that briefing has not changed at all. There's nothing in that briefing that changed my mind that this is an immediate national security threat and that we're going to remove this platform for 170 million Americans. And so with
Chair now recognizes ranking member asking for his questions.
But we're actually going to go to Mr. Garcia to begin.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you again. I just want to, just for the record, be very clear that in Mr. Obolinski's testimony, he has provided zero evidence of any sort of link between Hunter Biden and the president as far as it relates to the business dealings. And so once again, we're back to a hearing where no evidence is being provided of any sort of wrongdoing by the president. But I want to go back, Mr. Obolinski, actually it's my time, sir. Mr. Obolinski, I want to go back to the private deposition that we had. I was one of a handful of Democrats in that private, on the record, under oath conversation we had. And during that deposition, I asked you a question of which you gave a false answer to, and I want to go back to that. I asked you specifically who got you into the presidential debate that was attended by you and others, and that, of course, was a huge moment in that campaign, and you could not recall. In fact, you said, quote, "I do not recall who got me into the debate." Do you remember telling me that, sir?
You were playing semantics, trying to ask me as if somebody called me directly and gave me a ticket like
Sir,
I was going to a movie
sir, I
theater.
asked you, I
told you
I'm going to
that
reclaim my time,
lawyers
sir.
ordered
I'm going to
me.
reclaim my time. What I
Well,
said
you
was,
just asked me a question, Mr.
I'm reclaiming my time. Thank you, sir. Actually, what I asked you was, do you recall who actually got you into the presidential debate? You actually said, quote, "I do not recall who got me into the debate." You did not remember who got you into the debate between President Biden and between Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
That's
of course,
not a true statement.
Sir, you quoted, I don't recall who got me into the debate. It's on page 102 of the transcript.
You did not
Sir,
ask me
I asked
whether
you
I
that
was
question.
a guest of Mr.
Thank you.
Biden
I'll
or a
reclaim my
guest
time.
of
I'm not asking you a question right now. Thank you very much, sir. In fact, here, as was shown by Ranking Member Raskin, we know that you were in the debate actually sitting adjacent and next to Trump officials. When we were confronted again on this same question, Mr. Bobulinski, if you were a guest of Mr. Trump's at the debate, you responded and you quoted, once the Wall Street Journal called you out, quote, is the Wall Street Journal God or something? Like you act like this is some encyclopedia of fact. And you refuse to still confirm that you were a guest of Donald Trump. So I want to ask you one more time, sir. Were you a guest of Donald Trump at the presidential debate?
Mr. Garcia, those were not the questions you asked me in my transcribed interview.
Wow.
You were trying
to
ask
answer the question, sir. Were you a guest of
clearly
Donald Trump?
Of Donald Trump at the gate, or at the debate.
You were.
That was obvious to everyone in the world at that point.
Oh, it's interesting.
You were asking me semantic
Thank you, sir. So you were a guest? That you answered the question. Because at the time you said in the transcript, under oath, I don't recall who got me into the debate. So just to be clear. So I want to keep going. So you also call yourself, you're not a political person, yet you went to a presidential debate on behalf of Donald Trump. I also want to make it clear that you made numerous claims and allegations. You've made them today, you've made them before. And yet, even though you're not a political person, this is also another photo of you, you actually chose to show up at a press conference for Donald Trump prior to the debate because you're not a political person. Did you show up to a press conference for Donald Trump before the debate?
I can't qualify whether it was for Donald Trump.
Do you know who invited you? Sir, who invited you to the debate? Donald Trump, you said. Who invited you to the press conference?
Who invited me to my lawyers coordinated things, and I showed up at a.
Well, sir, I will tell you, it was Jason Miller, it's been very clear, it's been reported, who actually worked on the part of the Donald Trump campaign. Here you are at a Donald Trump press conference, and you can't remember how you got to the press conference. You refuse to answer how you actually got into the Donald Trump debate with Joe Biden. Do you remember speaking at the press conference?
I do very clearly.
You do. Do you know who Jason Miller is, sir?
I do know of him, yes.
Do you know that he was a Trump campaign staffer?
Mr. Garcia, you keep asking me semantical questions. You underestimate that I had 3 lawyers around me that were coordinating my travel, where I was going, and stuff
well, sir,
like that.
interesting.
So please stop.
Well, I'll reclaim my time. Thank you very much. It's interesting, sir, because you show up to a pre-debate press conference. You show up to a presidential debate, both invited to by a person running for the presidency of the United States. You know the stakes are high, yet you have no idea how you got to the press conference. You don't remember how you got to the debate. And here you are speaking at a press conference of which the national media, so how did you get to this press conference?
I flew on a plane.
Who invited you?
Are we going in circles?
Sir, who invited you to the press conference?
My lawyers told me I was invited to come to Tennessee. At that point, I was trying to get the truth and the facts out to the American people. At that moment in time, if I recall, I believe 80 million people watched that debate, and that was probably the number one.
Thank you, sir. I reclaim my time. Well, with that, I think it's very clear for someone that can't remember how I got to a Donald Trump press conference or a Donald Trump debate, you're completely an uncredible witness, sir. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've previously.
Thank you, Chairman. This is actually a pretty interesting debate. First of all, this is a good bill. We should support this measure for a number of reasons. Number one, I'm glad that the members are bringing up the 14th Amendment. This is actually quite critical because at the writing of the 14th Amendment, even though its thought has been expanded to encapsulate many things in American society. The original premise of the 14th Amendment was for black slaves who were no longer slaves and now were dual citizens of the United States. So then, if you're going to now go towards the act of apportionment, yeah, they have to be counted because now they are citizens of the United States because slavery was at an end. That is the purpose of the 14th. The issue we're facing in America today is not that you have people who have come to the United States either A, illegally, or B, through what I would call abuses of federal law by President Biden coming into the United States in massive amounts. If you count them for the apportionment base, they are not citizens of the United States. They do not have the legal authority to vote in our elections in the United States, yet we are going to count them for the purposes of setting congressional districts in the United States? That makes no sense. The bill is clear. People are still counted if they're not citizens, but they are not used in the calculation for setting apportionment. And that is a key distinction. To my colleague on the other side who mentioned that inaccurate counts lead to things, they impact schools, they impact hospitals, they impact benefits in local communities and in states all through the country. That's correct, which is why we shouldn't go down the pathway of importing millions of people into our country, either ignoring federal law, flouting federal law. We should not do that because it does impact the communities in our country in negative ways. There are young kids in the United States who are not getting the education they deserve because now you have other children in these classrooms who have less education or no education and don't even speak English, or in a lot of respects, even Spanish. They speak other languages. And so now resources are having to be moved around from those kids who are United States citizens. These are major implications.
Sir, will you yield for a question?
Hold on, I got a couple points to make, and I'll yield to a question. You have Denver, Colorado. 5% of Denver's population is now made up of illegal immigrants. They are overwhelming the hospital system in Denver, Colorado. So yes, when you have these actions from a chief executive who is not faithfully executing immigration and border security law, he is not. When that happens, there has to be a response from Congress, which is where Section 5 of the 14th Amendment does come into play. This is a good piece of legislation because what we cannot have now is the precedent where you just have massive flows of people being brought to us by the drug cartels and by the coyotes. Let's be honest about what's happening. And then we say we're now going to use that to be the basis for accounting and allowing for apportionment of congressional districts when these same people cannot vote. They cannot. So this is a good bill. We should support this bill. And what we should not do is, frankly, gaslight the American people into thinking that we are now somehow changing apportionment, because even the framers of the Constitution or the writers of the 14th Amendment would have never allowed for non-citizens to this massive amount to be counted for the purposes of setting congressional districts. And I would say the ranking member spoke to that when he did talk about the history of the 3/5 compromise at the onset of the United States Constitution. I'll yield to a question.
Thank you. Look, I think we can have a debate about immigration and what proposals are, and I agree nobody wants just endless flows of folks that we can't actually manage and control. Nobody's arguing for that. But we have to understand that in this country, the counting of every single person impacts every single type of government service that's provided through the states and through cities. So what you're really arguing about is that young kids in classrooms, or seniors that are in hospital beds, or people that are trying to recover from massive pandemics and emergencies would not get support because they wouldn't be counted through the one system that our government uses to provide public services to all people in this country.
So, Mr. Garcia,
regardless of how a child may have
Ms. Garcia, I got to reclaim my time because I got 15 seconds to respond. The bill allows for the count. You're just not counted in the base for apportionment. And that's a clear delineation from the argument that you were making. We cannot make people fill out the census. We do not have the police powers to do so.
And this would make less people fill the census.
Mr. Garcia, I yielded to you, but now I'm offended.
No, you're right, you're right.
We do not have police powers to make people fill out the census. We have American citizens who do not fill out the census. We have to do the right thing when it comes to apportioning congressional districts, because that does impact the representation of the American people, the voting population, the citizens of the United States, and frankly, people who are in our country illegally or do not have citizenship status do not also have the ability to impact the political nature of the United States. That flies in the very basis of representative republic and of representative democracy. I yield.
Gentlemen, time's expired. Chair now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, thank you, Dr. Califf. I appreciate you being here and all your work and the work of the FDA. I was going to talk a little bit about a different topic, but I just want to clarify some of the truly insane attacks on vaccines and just what happened during the pandemic that we heard a little bit earlier today, which I found to be really wild. I just want to reiterate that during the pandemic, we lost 1.3 million American lives. In my city alone, we lost almost 1,300 lives back home in California, in the city of Long Beach. And we know that many of the folks that we lost would have lived if they had had access to the vaccine or had been vaccinated. We know that for a fact. We know the success of vaccines, and certainly today with more data, we know how effective they've been. What's concerning now, as we know, is as early childhood vaccinations are reaching new lows. We're having other diseases come forward, like measles and other diseases that we are now not addressing because all of this vaccine denial that is happening, unfortunately, not just across this country, but also here in Congress and in this chamber. Vaccine hesitancy outside of what happened to COVID-19 is going to cause this country great harm. And instead of doing the responsible thing, earlier today we had folks on the other side attack vaccines with, in my opinion, conspiracy theories and with treatments that we know are ineffective and have shown not to work. We also know this is not just a matter of personal choice. Across the country, there are millions of people who don't have the choice and who cannot get vaccinated because they might be too young, they might be immunocompromised, or have other underlying health conditions. And so America's high vaccination rates is something that has helped our country for so long that the FDA has been so involved with, and it's very concerning that our vaccination rates and our vaccine process is being attacked. I also want to note that there have been comments made over and over again about vaccines, about somehow vaccines causing turbo cancers or vaccines causing miscarriages, or that the COVID vaccine somehow has no effect on healthy people, that are all false. And I know that you know this, your team knows this, and I just want to reiterate that for the public. What I did want to say, and I have less time to do so, but I wanted just to transition and just thank you and your team for what you're doing as it relates to listening to the LGBTQ plus community. Myself, as an openly gay person, I really appreciate the FDA's move and decisions allowing particularly gay men to be a part of the solution when it comes to health, when it comes to blood donations, when it comes to other forms of surrogacy. The FDA has really stepped forward, and especially on the recent change in guidelines as it relates to LGBTQ plus Americans and gay men being able to donate blood. I think that as a gay person, it's comforting to know that if there was an emergency where my blood or other blood was needed, that we would have that same right. And thanks to all of you. Dr. Califf, in the time I have remaining, could you describe the FDA's draft proposal and how this helps advance equality while also expanding the donor pool as relates to the recent changes you guys you're all making?
All right, simply, first of all, let me just say I appreciate your comments. Just back on the vaccines, just one point I want to make. All medical interventions have risks as well as benefits. In the earlier discussion, if you want to be alive and not be in an intensive care unit, you're better off getting vaccinated. There are some people that have side effects. I just want to note that because it's important to take care of those people also, but the benefits far outweigh the risks. Simply put, the question that you asked, people had raised this issue about donation for many years, and we did a study which showed that a questionnaire about behavior can do much better than just a time-based thing related to the LGBTQ community. So we are well along in that now, and it looks like it's really going to work, and we'll be consistent with what other countries are doing. So we're really glad we were able to come to this conclusion.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your work and for your team's work. I yield back.
Chair now recognize Mr. Fry.
I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Garcia for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses that are here today. Now, I want to just start on, we all know that on June 16, 2015, Donald Trump rode down the escalator at Trump Tower to launch his campaign for president. And I want to remind us what he said that day, and I quote, "When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you, they're not sending you, they're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists," end quote. Now, we all know that's who Donald Trump is, and he controls the Republican Party, so we are here today. He's basing his 2024 campaign, as we all know, on the exact same rhetoric. Now, just weeks ago, Trump referred to immigrants who enter the country illegally as, quote, animals, nearly half a dozen times. He literally said, and I quote, Democrats say, please don't call them animals, they're humans, Trump said. Quote, I said, no, they're not humans, they're animals, end quote. He's also repeatedly claimed that South American countries are emptying their what he calls insane asylums and mental institutions to send the patients to the U.S. as migrants. Now, we know that's not happening, and here's evidence that even his own campaign can't provide any evidence for in what he said. What he continues to say are lies and untruths. These fact checks are important. Now, I'm an immigrant. I came here as a young child. My parents came here to build better lives. My mom worked as a healthcare worker. When I took an oath to become a U.S. citizen, it was the proudest day of my life. And so I personally am offended, not just from what I hear, but for the way Donald Trump and the House majority speaks about migrants and folks that come here for a better life. Donald Trump wants to claim that people like me and my family are poisoning the blood of our country, as he likes to say. It's disgusting and it's un-American. And it has real consequences, like the white supremacists at Charlottesville, who Trump called, and I quote, very fine people. It provokes people like the white nationalists who targeted people of Mexican descent in El Paso, murdering 23 innocent people. Now, I love this country. I know that our chairman also loves this country, but I also think it's important that we don't divide all of us that are here. We should cut through the noise and actually look at some of the facts and data. And as much as some in the House majority may not like facts and data, it's important to review them. I want to run through some unanimous consent requests. Here's NBC. Trump's claims of a migrant crime wave are not supported by national data. Thank you. Here's a second one. ABC, and I quote, no, migrants are not driving a surge in violent crime, as Trump claims. Thank you. Here's another one. USA Today. No, migrants aren't more likely to commit crimes than U.S.-born, despite Trump's border speech.
No objection.
Thank you. And if you prefer maybe academic sources, here's research from Stanford, which looked at 140 years of data. 140 years of data, and finds conclusively that migration does not increase crime. Right now, in fact, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than people born in the United States. 60% less likely. And let's be clear, undocumented people are less likely to be incarcerated than native-born people as well. And here's a Brennan Center report which hopefully points out that, and I quote, the spike in violent crime happened on Trump's watch, not Biden's. In 2020, the final year of the Trump presidency, murder rose by nearly 30% and assault by more than 10%. So I'd like to submit that as well, sir. Thank you. So just to conclude, under President Biden, crime has fallen nationwide, and those are the facts. So I just hope that we can stop with the fear-mongering, and I look forward to the rest of the hearing.
Question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'm sorry you had to listen to a lot of misinformation right now and throughout this hearing. And I also, just for the record, you are here. You're doing a very difficult job. Even though some folks are trying to remove you from office, we know that's not going to happen. The impeachment sham against you is dead on arrival in the Senate. And so I look forward to you continuing to do a very difficult job for the country and for the administration. Now, I want to just note, since you last testified, we know that Donald Trump has also become the presumptive nominee of his party. Immigrants like you and me remember and understand and know his dangerous rhetoric and the way he talks about immigrants like us. But I want to go back to his 2016 words. I think it's important to put those back into the record. Quote, when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Now, it's interesting because you and I both know that non-citizens are 60% less likely to actually commit crimes than citizens. And so he's just using this xenophobic rhetoric to demonize migrants that are trying, in many cases, searching for a better life and running away from extreme violent positions in their home countries. And this rhetoric, we know, has continued. Trump calls immigrants who enter the country oftentimes animals. He just did this so recently. And he said, and I quote, this is a quote, Democrats say, please don't call them animals, they're humans. Trump said, quote, I said, no, they're not humans, they're animals. This is dehumanizing rhetoric, and it's wrong and not acceptable. Now, Mr. Secretary, does this type of rhetoric fuel violence here in the United States?
Congressman, I'm going to refrain from opining on the words of a particular candidate given the Hatch Act restrictions.
No, I appreciate that. But what I will say, though, is that his rhetoric is wrong and disturbing, and his policies are actually worse. And we know that President Trump has said he would immediately launch the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. I want to now note and talk a little bit about something that Donald Trump has also tried to characterize as we talk about migrants. He and one of his main lieutenants, Stephen Miller, has promised large-scale raids and actually has suggested using National Guard troops, even sending National Guard troops from Republican-led states into neighboring states led by Democrats. And what we're seeing now in Texas, there's real risk there. Certainly if we see National Guards being used this way in the future. Can your opinion about the National Guards being used in Texas?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the precise?
Based on what we're seeing now in Texas, do you think there's additional risk, that we could see National Guard being used in a way that could be dangerous at the border?
Congressman, the deployment of National Guard can be an effective force multiplier when it is coordinated with federal authorities, specifically the United States Border Patrol. When it is not, it presents a risk to our efforts to secure the border.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And I think we just saw that recently play out in a very dangerous and disturbing way. Now, I want to also note something about the way the incumbent president views migration and the way he views the world. And I think it's important to point out. We know that in 2016, Donald Trump launched his campaign by pointing out that Mexicans are essentially rapists and murderers. We've seen that already. In 2018, he told members of Congress in the Oval Office, when they discussed protecting immigrants from African countries, that he didn't want any migrants from what he called shithole countries. And that's his quote, not mine. Trump then suggested that the U.S. should instead bring more people from countries such as Norway, because apparently they're nice immigrants. And let's not forget that he tried over and over again to ban Muslims coming from this country as well. All the while, he continues to fuel extremism and violence by claiming falsely that he won the 2020 election. Now, Trump continues with his view of the world to attack a legal immigration system that actually works. We know that visas fell every year during Trump's administration. There was a hiring freeze at the U.S. Citizenship and Customs Immigration Service, and his administration has used every possible way of disqualifying and denying visas. Mr. Secretary, can you tell us how policies like denying visas actually undermines our situation at the border?
Congressman, individuals who qualify for visas significantly contribute to the well-being and advancement of this country, and that is quite evident, especially in the economic arena. We've seen that with skilled workers, non-skilled seasonal workers, agricultural workers, and many other avenues. We are enriched by them.
Thank you, sir. I think I'm out of time here, so I'll yield back. Yep. Thank you. I've only been in Congress for a year. I served as mayor for 8 years before that. That is just not the way that you actually take data on crime. So I think we also need to be realistic and honest about the way crime is measured in the United States. It's measured when a crime is committed, that's when you take the data. So this idea of folks running away or not being captured or we're not capturing this crime or that crime is just factually incorrect. I also just want to note that prior to my service as mayor, I was an educator for 10 years in the classroom at the college level, and we use data to make decisions. This idea that we're not going to use data to actually make decisions, I think is interesting, and I certainly don't agree with it. I want to ask some questions about data and about facts, not about what we think is happening or may not be happening. Mr. Beer, good to see you again. I want to put this poster up. I think it's important. And before we get to the border, I just want you to remind us, who was president in 2020 again?
Donald Trump.
Thank you. Now, is it true that under Donald Trump, murder rates surged by 30%, according to data collected by police departments across America, to the highest rate since the 90s?
Yes, absolutely. Surge in the summer of 2020.
And this data was collected by our men and women in police, like the Long Beach Police Department, which I honorably represented and helped support back in my community. Now, since 2020, when we know that President Biden was elected, have violent crime rates increased or fallen?
They've fallen year after year, yes.
In fact, they have fallen dramatically. Is that correct?
And we just have reporting early this fiscal year, or this 2024, that they're continuing to fall.
So crime is at incredibly high levels when Donald Trump is elected, and now overall violent crime has dramatically decreased now that President Biden is in office. Is that correct?
Over the last 4 years, crime has fallen.
Thank you. And that's actually data reported by our cops. So we want to believe our men and women and law enforcement. That's the data that they're providing us. I also want to talk about some violent crime trackers that we've discussed. Murder, we know, has plummeted in the U.S. since 2023, one of the fastest rates of decline we've ever actually had. Now, Mr. Beer, there are 45 million immigrants in this country. Now, why do you think Donald Trump is pushing this migrant crime narrative, which we know is not true?
Well, it's because he wants to push policies that ban immigrants. We saw what he did when he was in office. He didn't reduce illegal immigration. He banned legal immigration to the United States.
Now, and is it fair to say that Trump's rhetoric accusing people, by the way, like me and my family, of poisoning the blood of this country or claiming that we're fueling an invasion actually fuels a potential for violence?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the number of criminals who have engaged in mass shootings. I mean, you're looking at the Pittsburgh shooter, you're like El Paso, Buffalo, Charlottesville. You go down the list, and there are so many times where you hear this great replacement rhetoric being used to justify. Of course, there's crazy people on all sides of every debate, but we shouldn't be fueling it with irresponsible and inaccurate rhetoric.
And we've already said and noted that the data provided to us by the men and women of our police departments across the country is also clear that non-citizens, undocumented migrants, actually commit less crimes, actually a lot less crimes than naturalized citizens. Is that correct?
That's right. 75% less for legal immigrants, 50% less for illegal immigrants. So a very significant difference.
And it's also true that if you look at most of our major American cities, when you actually look at the undocumented population versus citizens, that those cities, that, again, crime is being committed at a much higher rate by citizens than non-citizens. Is that correct?
That's right. We've looked at the border sector in cities in particular with a great deal of focus on them because they have so much cross-border traffic. They're among the safest in the United States, and they saw some of the fastest declines in crime in the 1990s and 2000s when their immigrant populations exploded.
And so I think it's really important to paint a real picture of immigration, of migrants, of immigrants that are coming to this country to search for a better life, and move away from the xenophobic rhetoric that tears down migrants, that tries to somehow paint them as murderers and rapists when the data does not actually support those arguments. And so this idea that we're not going to look at data, I think is just, it's a joke, it's unfair, and it's certainly causing more damage across the country than anything positive. I want to just return to some of our policies as well. Now, Mr. Beer, one of the majority's witnesses today was, we know, one of the architects of Trump's immigration agenda, which included unprecedented restrictions on legal immigration. To close for my questioning, how did that actually impact the actual border, those Trump policies?
Well, when we restrict legal immigration and asylum, we incentivize people to cross the border illegally. If we tell them there's no opportunity to come to this country legally, then of course you're going to see more people go to the border and try to seek safety and opportunity that way. It's counterproductive. It's a failed policy. It resulted in more evasions like I talked about. That's a problem for security. We want Border Patrol to focus on serious threats, not people coming for safety and opportunity in this country.
Thank you, sir, and I yield back.
Expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Garcia from California.
Thank you. Been a wild hearing so far. I know that the majority is very interested in looking into China. I think we should definitely look into the influence China plays in our politics. And I just want to start by reminding us of this man. And I'm sure that our chairman and my Republican colleagues will recognize this gentleman over here. This, of course, is Gal Luft. We know that a Chinese spy, Gal Luft, infiltrated this committee's sham impeachment inquiry against President Biden with false allegations. Now, according to his federal indictment, Gal paid a former U.S. government official who was a Donald Trump advisor to, quote, publicly support certain policies favorable to China. He also sold Chinese arms around the world. Now, our chairman, who wanted this gentleman to be a witness, called him, quote, a very credible witness. This is a Chinese spy we're talking about, just because Gal Luft was willing to help Republicans smear the president. So when we're talking about China's influence, it starts with The House majority, our chairman, wanting to have a witness, this man, who actually was a Chinese spy. So it's completely ridiculous for Republicans to claim to get tough on China while they're working with literal Chinese agents to spread misinformation. Goes to show you what a joke this is. Now, this isn't, of course, the only example of the majority's hypocrisy.
Will the gentleman yield to a question?
I'm going to keep going, sir, because we know that one of the most important tools to stop hostile foreign influence in our government is the Constitution. Now, Professor Snyder, what role does the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution play in protecting against foreign influence?
Since it seems to be the rule here that people jump around a bit, I'm just going to respond to the absent questioner.
Actually, sir, I need you to respond to just to...
I will, trust me. But the item that was entered into the record regarding me, when members read it, they will find that it is the Stalinist objection to Timothy Snyder that they have entered into the record. That book review is from the point of view of someone defending the one-party Leninist state, which colleagues and I believe
Thank you, sir. I need
is the problem.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, the Emoluments Clause is a fundamental example of the wisdom of the founders in recognizing the possibility of financial corruption in the head of state.
Thank you. And the Emoluments Clause is very important. We know that foreign influence on a president is clearly a serious threat. And the evidence is clear, as our ranking member mentioned. We have actually evidence that China funneled cash to Donald Trump through his businesses while he was president. That is illegal, and it threatens national security. The Trump International Hotel, more stays at the hotel in Vegas, Trump Tower, over $5.5 million. The People's Republic of China, including state-owned enterprises, made unconstitutional payments in excess of 5.5 to the Trump Organization. And those millions into Donald Trump's pockets are just a small sample of the total payments we received. And as a reminder, our chairman actually cut off the investigation into Trump's business activities. So we only have documentation for about 2 years. Now, just months ago, the Republicans blocked my motion to subpoena Donald Trump's accountants for their records on this cover-up, which is an absolute crime. And in 2016, Trump said, "I love China. The biggest bank in the world is from China." The Department of Justice found that that same bank was being used as a front to funnel money into North Korea. I also want to talk about, it's not just about China, of course. We can document illegal money going into Trump's businesses while he was president from multiple companies, from multiple countries and companies. We know from China, 5.5 million, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, from all of these countries, there was illegal foreign payments made violating the Emoluments Clause. And this is only a small sample. We also know that this is a broader part of the grift that the Trump family is doing on the American people. We know that Donald Trump, for example, gave his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a job at the White House. We know that his son put together a $110 billion arms deal with the Saudi government. We know that Jared Kushner received a $2 billion investment fund from the Saudi government after just leaving the White House, just a month after leaving the White House. And so there's a lot of corruption that we can talk about. And even though Chairman Comer wants to invite spies that are working with China, doesn't want to investigate the payments that Trump was receiving from foreign governments, these are things that must be talked about and investigated. Professor Snyder, is it acceptable for a former U.S. official to get $2 billion from a foreign government for an investment fund right after leaving office?
That is totally unacceptable.
Thank you. And that's exactly what the Trump family is doing, continues to do, and to continue to put this huge grift on the American people. Mr. Comer, would you like to ask me a question?
Yeah. Are you aware that Gal Luft was charged by the Department of Justice for violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act because of the money he took from CEFC, which is the exact same company that paid the Bidens millions of dollars, the same company that Tony Bobulinski testified that Joe Biden was the big guy in a deal with?
Mr. Chairman Comer, are you aware that you called him a very credible witness, yet he's a Chinese spy?
Well, then is Hunter Biden and Joe, are they Chinese
sir,
spies?
You called Gal Luft a very credible witness who happened to be
He's a credible witness because he worked for the same company that Hunter and Biden and Joe Biden
for the
got
record,
paid for,
for
and
the
Jill
record,
Biden.
for the record,
True
our
Biden.
chairman, for the record, our
It's
chairman
the
is saying
same deal.
that a Chinese spy working for the Chinese government against the United States of America is a very credible witness. I yield back.
Credible because he got paid by the same company the Bidens got paid for. The same thing.
Company that gave millions of dollars to Donald Trump when he was president?
No, it's the same company that paid the Bidens millions of dollars. For what business was it? Again, Mr. Raskin, what business were the Bidens in? I forgot what you said.
Can you stop
saying the Bidens?
Jim Biden.
Hunter
Jim Biden
Biden
was a businessman.
No.
Mr. Bowman, can we have some
Biden is a
decorum?
public servant.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank
Mr. Speaker, we all know that our planet is the most important thing we have, which is why we make the necessary investments to protect it. Now, I'm proud to announce that I've joined forces with Senator Elizabeth Warren to introduce the Build Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Now, this bill is part of the Green New Deal and is a major step toward addressing climate change. It will invest $500 billion over 10 years to electrify and modernize public vehicles and trains across the country, all while building new electric transportation infrastructure in every major city in America. It will make our transportation networks safer and cleaner, from buses to trains to rail. And the bill links transit investments with increasing density and affordable housing. It will also help create millions of new green jobs with strong protections for labor. The Build Green Act is sustainable, equitable, and most importantly, necessary for protecting our future. We will continue working to combat our climate crisis and supporting a Green New Deal for every single American. Let's pass this bill now and electrify the nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Mr. Garcia.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight has been very interesting. I want to just take a moment just to put today in context. We're here right now at this late hour to accommodate the majority's field trip to praise their leader. And let's not forget that he left office in disgrace. Yes, gentle lady from Georgia, we're going to talk about that Donald Trump, who stole classified materials and stored them in his bathroom. He was investigated and indicted for his crimes. Now, Attorney General Garland set up a parallel investigation of President Biden's handling of classified documents as well. And that shows the Department of Justice is actually fair and independent. So to oversee this investigation, he appointed Robert Hur, a former U.S. attorney handpicked by Donald Trump. Robert Hur found no wrongdoing by President Biden. No wrongdoing by President Biden. But he chose to smear President Biden with a totally unprofessional and wrong assessment of the president's age and mental sharpness. Now, as we know, his assessment about President Biden was wrong because you can literally yourself read the transcript, which is over 250 pages long. Now, many of us, especially us Democrats, know the president. He is sharp. He is focused on the big issues. He's dealing with large challenges across the world. Now, the majority is hyping up this issue to distract us from the fact that Donald Trump keeps embarrassing himself in public. And as much as a gentle lady from Georgia and others may not like it, we know that Trump's public statements have been crazy and incoherent for years. And we know that he is too tired and sleepy to stay awake through his own criminal trial. It's not President Biden who's not sharp. It's, in fact, Donald Trump. Now, let's look at public reporting. I'm only going to talk about public reporting. His criminal trial started on April 15th. And here's a summary of the press reports. On his first day of his trial, Reuters reported that Trump appeared to doze off during jury selection. On April 16th, it was reported that Trump dropped his head inside the courtroom, keeping his eyes closed before jolting his head upright. On April 19th, the New York Times reported Trump's eyes remained, quote, closed for extended periods during the final day of jury selection. On April 22nd, MSNBC reported that Trump's lawyers were fighting to keep him awake. On April 30th, NBC and the New York Times reported that Trump nodded off for significant portions of witness testimony, and as we all know, basically kept his eyes closed for hours and hours on end. On May 9th, Trump's eyes remained closed for many minutes, and Trump later, of course, dozed on and off. And the reports go on and on. May 13th, Trump was, quote, asleep during the afternoon session. On May 14th, a political reporter said Trump slouched in his seat and closed his eyes and his mouth. Now, here we have a photo of Donald Trump, of course, through some of his trial. And I bring this up because it's Donald Trump that's asleep and that's hurting and dividing our country. And this attack on President Biden and his mental acuteness or his ability or his age is completely just a reason and an excuse for the Republicans to continue to attack President Biden when we all know that Donald Trump is the one that's unfit to be president. And that's where the majority is so desperate to be here today, because they want to help him get elected and hurt President Biden. Well, it's not going to work, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself first to offer an amendment. The clerk will distribute the amendment to all members. No, we're not done. We're not done. I'm just going to do an amendment, and then we'll have all the debate we want. And I know Mr. Goldman has an amendment he wants to offer. Ms. Luna has an amendment. And
the first part before the amendment.
We can go back to time on the A&S.
yeah, we can go back. Everybody will have an opportunity to talk. We're just going to go ahead and do the amendment in nature substitute. The clerk, does everyone have a copy? Okay, Ms. Boebert, I have to allow people to speak on that A&S if they want right now, so I will recognize you for 5 minutes. Ms.
Thank you,
Boebert.
Mr. Chairman. First, I just want to apologize to the American people. I don't think that this is the best use of our time when we are squabbling. It's one thing to have fun and laugh as members of Congress and try to find humor or some sort of lightheartedness in what we are doing. But when things get as heated as they have, it's unfortunately an embarrassment on our body as a whole. And so I just want to personally apologize to the American people for that. But we are here to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for ignoring subpoenas and believing that he is above the law. We simply want to hear what was said in the interview that was transcribed. Yes, we have the transcriptions, but the White House has recently edited President Biden's mistakes by labeling them, quote, inaudible in transcripts. The committee members must be able to assess for themselves that the transcripts accurately reflects the true content of the interviews. Now, the American people, fortunate or unfortunate, have heard Joe Biden speak for over 3 years now, really, if you include the campaign, about 4 years. And we have witnessed in real time a massive cognitive decline. President Trump, when he was in office, he underwent testing for his cognitive dissonance, for his ability to function as President of the United States, as the Commander-in-Chief. And unfortunately, I haven't seen Joe Biden even read a teleprompter properly and get through the reading without also adding in what's in the brackets when he needs to take a pause. And there are many things that we could go on here, but I want to hear the inflections in Joe Biden's responses when he is answering these questions. Now, on February 27th, 2024, the Oversight Committee issued a subpoena for relevant information regarding the special counsel's investigation, including the transcript and any recordings of the special counsel's interviews with President Biden in October of 2023. Now, to date, the Department of Justice has refused to provide the committee the audio recordings. It's a very simple request. It can be provided at any time, but maybe, just maybe, this administration that has tried to cover up so much and tried to physically lift up Joe Biden and keep him upright is hiding even more. So we just want to hear how that interview actually went. I am in favor of moving forward to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. I think there are many other things that we need to have him in for and move forward on in holding him accountable. I mean, he's gone after so many American citizens, moms and dads who attend school board meetings, those of the Catholic faith. The DOJ has been completely weaponized, and it's very sad for our country. But this hearing will continue. We have many amendments. I'm sure there will be much dialogue. Hopefully, there is some decorum on both sides of the aisle. And if in my remaining 1 minute, I could request you know, every so often, Mr. Garcia, maybe you could just lift up that picture of our President Trump sleeping. As you say, I think he's praying. But if he is sleeping, you know, he certainly looks pretty while he sleeps. Maybe it's an endearing moment of prayer, though. I know when I fall asleep on airplanes, you know, my mouth kind of drops open. And, you know, his mouth is kind of tight-lipped, so maybe it's just a somber moment of
I mean,
thought.
he's sleeping. It's been reported by multiple press outlets.
I was in the
that he's
courtroom
actually
today,
sleeping.
and I could see why someone would fall asleep, just like George Conway fell asleep today in the court hearing. You know, it's kind of slow in there. It's not as exciting as the House Oversight Committee, but I just wanted to say that's a lovely picture you have of President Trump, Mr. Garcia. Thank you, and I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. Does any other member wish to speak on the underlying?
Well, good morning, everyone, and I know we're going to take some questions in a minute. I'm going to pass it over back to our ranking member, but I wanted just to take us back, which I think is really important, just a couple years ago, to what actually was going on in our country. We lost over 1.3 million Americans, the single largest loss of life event in modern American history. The economy was crashing. We're facing a massive recession. Businesses were closing, schools were closed, children were having to adjust to this whole entire new environment. And at the same time, we had the President of the United States, Donald Trump, giving out oftentimes horrific and dangerous medical advice, not listening to his advisors, and taking an irresponsible approach working with cities and healthcare systems. Now, I was mayor of a community during that entire time, and I remember how horrific that moment was for all of us. It's important to remember the stakes and the ability of this committee to actually do good work. But instead of focusing on how we make healthcare systems better, on how we improve the process for the next pandemic, because there will be another pandemic, on how we actually learn and work with our school systems to improve our education process during these types of medical emergencies, we have done none of that. Now, for me personally, I take great offense to the attacks on Dr. Fauci and our medical professionals. My mom, who was a healthcare worker, died of COVID during the pandemic. My stepdad also died of COVID during the pandemic. I lost 2 parents during the COVID pandemic. They would have taken the vaccine in a second if it had been available to them before they passed away. And so the attacks on vaccines, on science, on healthcare, on Dr. Fauci are shameful. And we should all be disgusted by it. Dr. Fauci is the closest thing that we had to someone taking heroic actions and giving us good advice and moral clarity during the pandemic. This whole idea that somehow he orchestrated this pandemic, this global conspiracy, is insane. And today, the Democrats on the Select Subcommittee are going to push back on every single lie, on every single untruth, on every single attack on science and the medical community. And I want to also reemphasize what was said earlier by my colleagues. The House Republicans on this committee and former President Donald Trump are currently today causing massive harm to the country. There's less folks getting their vaccines, there's more conspiracies around science, and the attacks are not helping us prepare for the next pandemic. It's incredibly disappointing, but we're going to push back when we go into this committee. And with that, I want to turn this back over to our incredible leader of this committee and our ranking member, Dr. Raul Ruiz.
Fired before the point of order. I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I am so sorry you just had to sit through that. That was completely irresponsible. Quite frankly, we are hearing, this might be the most insane hearing I've actually attended. I've only been in Congress for a year and a half, but I am so sorry that you are subjected to those level of attacks and insanity. Your quote-unquote so-called science that the gentlewoman is referring to has saved millions of lives in this country and around the world, and I want to thank you for that. I also think it's important to note that, in my opinion, is that you are an American hero, and your team has done more to save lives than all 435 members of this body on both sides of the aisle. You guys have worked not just during this pandemic, but over time to save millions of lives in this country and across the world. We lost 1.1 million American lives. 1.1 million American lives, 7 million lives around the world. We were having 9/11-like events, death events daily in this country, losing 4,000, 5,000 people every single day. I was mayor during the time of the pandemic. I remember how painful it was to close businesses, to shut down schools, but how quickly we forget the pain and how scared we were as a country. We were washing our groceries as they were coming in. We were keeping seniors at a distance. The tragedy that was happening in our nursing homes. Thousands of people were dying a day, and you and your team of the best and the brightest scientists in this country and the world were doing everything that you could and working night and day to save more and more of those lives. A lot of my colleagues know that my mom was a healthcare worker during the pandemic. My mom died of COVID. My stepfather died of COVID. I lost both of my parents during the pandemic. So I take this very personally, especially when other members of this body who are tasked to be responsible and to actually help the American people attack medical professionals like you and across the world. Vaccines, the vaccine that you and your team helped foster have saved millions of American lives. These attacks are ridiculous. Now, even before this committee started, and I'm going to point a few things out. Even before this committee started, this same member that just went on this rant introduced the Fire Fauci Act and promoted it on a podcast, saying that COVID was a bioweapon. That is how insane some of these comments are. And I want to quote this. This is a quote from the same member. "I don't believe in evolution. These viruses were not making people sick until they created them. They weaponize these viruses to be able to attach to our cells and make us sick. It's a bioweapon." The "they created them," sir, is you. They are attacking you and our medical community for actually creating COVID that has caused the deaths of millions. And we know that these extreme comments are targeting public health officials across the country. I also want to show you this other comment. Same member who just attacked you. "The Fauci-funded Wuhan lab created the virus." This is so crazy and irresponsible. In this post, the same member of this committee is accusing you of orchestrating a global conspiracy to create COVID on purpose just to make people get vaccines. That you've done this, sir. This same member routinely promotes complete misinformation about vaccines and actually has encouraged the routine prevention of vaccinations that even eliminate diseases like the measles. Dr. Fauci, you've brought together our nation and the world's best and brightest scientists to take on COVID and create a vaccine that works. I want to ask you a question. I want to be crystal clear for the public. You brought together the world and America's best scientists. Do you believe that the vaccine that you all helped create and ensure is safe and effective for the public?
Yes, and its track record has proven that.
And do you also agree that it saved hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of lives in America and across the world?
That is absolutely correct. And it's very clear that it's saved millions of lives here and throughout the world. The Europeans have done the same studies that we have, and the data are incontrovertible that they save lives.
Sir, and do you think the American public should listen to America's brightest and best doctors and scientists, or instead listen to podcasters, conspiracy theorists, and unhinged Facebook memes?
No, listening to people who you just described is going to do nothing but harm people because they will deprive themselves of life-saving interventions, which has happened. And you know, some have done studies. Peter Hotez has done an analysis of this and shows that in people who refuse to get vaccinated for any variety of reasons, probably responsible for an additional 200,000 to 300,000 deaths in this country.
Thank you, sir, and your entire team for saving lives in this country. And I'm sorry you have to continue going on with these attacks. I yield back. Oh, thank you. You're not allowed to speak.
You're not allowed.
Thank you. Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Chairman, could you have her removed from the?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
Please have her removed.
please.
Excuse me, I asked the Capitol Police to escort.
Yep, thank you. She can be removed. Yeah, you can be removed. Actually, you're not allowed to speak.
Your time has
Take your
expired.
Starbucks with you.
Mr. Garcia, Mr. Raskin, you're out of line. Your times have expired. I now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I have to say,
the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Appreciate that. Our country obviously faces unprecedented challenges and threats on both the domestic and international stage. We were just discussing one of our major threats, of course, globally. We also know that climate catastrophes like the Maui fires, to repelling Russian expansion in the Arctic, to supporting our allies in the Indo-Pacific in the face of Chinese aggression. All of these are absolutely critical to the Coast Guard, to Coast Guard readiness, and to the ability for the Coast Guard to do its job. In a world that's becoming more and more dangerous, our partnerships and alliances keep us strong. Our Coast Guard's presence and operations across the globe are vital to maintaining those friendships. I was mayor of Long Beach, California prior to this. I think I've met some of you before, and obviously work with our Coast Guard very closely. We have one of America's largest ports, and so the work the Coast Guard does there is incredibly important. And the professionalism of the Coast Guard is incredible, so thank you. Obviously, this work is bipartisan. That's really important. We also know, then talking about China, that China is clearly a competitor and someone that our relationship is increasingly complicated. And we also need to recognize at the same time that China is our largest trading partner. It's America's #1 trading partner by far. And our economies are also linked together by trade, particularly coming in through our West Coast ports. We also want to make sure that the Coast Guard has an important relationship to play in that relationship. Mr. Cooper, I want to thank you for being here and your many years of service to the Coast Guard. I wanted to ask, we've recently seen escalations of China's behavior, both on the economic side and on the military side. These actions endanger the economies and livelihoods of the island nations and, of course, threaten our U.S. interests. What can the Coast Guard do, perhaps separately than DOD, that's different to DOD, that maybe DOD can't do, to further our U.S. interests in the region?
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the question. The Coast Guard obviously does a lot more than just security, right? They do the environmental response. They also have the ability to project defense operations. They do port, waterway, coastal security. They do aids to navigation. So working with the partners in the Indo-Pacific, their presence there allows them to not only provide training for security, but also search and rescue if needed, as well as environmental response or humanitarian assistance. So it's a multi-pronged capability that the Coast Guard brings to the table.
Thank you, and want to expand on some of the challenges, particularly with China. According to the Illegal and Reported Unregulated Fishing Index, China ranks as the worst offender of all 152 countries worldwide that are tracked. A recent strategic report from the U.S. Coast Guard assessed that illegal fishing has replaced piracy as a leading global maritime security threat. Clearly, we're destroying ocean ecosystems, crippling food chains, threatening sustainable fisheries. Of the 36 nations within the Indo-Pacific region, nearly all are maritime nations, with over 1/3 being smaller island nations. Mr. Cooper, can you walk us through the role that the Coast Guard is playing in supporting these nations and addressing the issue of China's illegal fishing?
Yes, thank you again for the question, Congressman. So the Coast Guard has been very innovative and leaning forward in some of their support to the Indo-Pacific nations, not only with the training. When I was active duty, we would train a lot of those forces on securing their own sovereignty, providing them the capabilities and the capacity to do that. So in addition, we work closely with the Navy through the Oceanic Maritime Security Initiative, which focuses on IUU fishing. They've put the additional fast response cutters in region, and then they also have the Indo-Pacific Support Tender, which is out there doing IUU fishing, and they've signed some pretty substantial shipwrighter agreements with 12 of the countries, or 12 of the nations in the region, particularly allowing the Coast Guard to do boardings and enforce IUU fishing infractions in those nations' waters without a shipwrighter present, which is a tremendous capability that they've provided to those countries.
Thank you. And we know, that China has a massive fishing fleet, much larger than any other nation in the world. Illegal behavior around fishing from the Chinese is very common. Our partners like Vietnam and Philippines in the Pacific and smaller island nations, of course, don't have anywhere near the resources or capabilities to secure their own waters. Now, I understand, and we've discussed this here actually at this subcommittee before, that the Coast Guard only has about 5 cutters that are currently operating in the Indo-Pacific region, which spans, of course, 40 million square miles. Mr. Sadler, can you give us some insight onto how an expanded fleet of cutters would actually enable the Coast Guard to both effectively enforce the maritime law, but also safety for mariners and coasties?
Absolutely, thank you. The question is how can you maintain the right presence at the right place in an immense Pacific Ocean, and it comes down to numbers. Coast Guard is long overdue in providing publicly what that force would require, fixed-wing aircraft at places like Canton Island and Kiribati. So you have to also have places as well as ships to do repairs, having repair facilities in, say, American Samoa, and then having those cutters out patrolling our EEZs firstly, and then working and playing, to use a football term, playing man, using collective intelligence gathering and following these dark fleets, and then vectoring in with our allies and partners in the region to watch and to ensure and regulate these largely unregulated distant fishing fleets, Chinese fishing fleets. And things like the Pacific Quad with France, New Zealand, and Australia, long-standing, is a venue for doing that. And then also, as already mentioned by Captain Cooper, using shipwriters and actually having virtual call-in to the justice, the equivalent of the justice departments in these island nations to effect arrests and then to transfer those people to their own shoreside justice system. So there's a lot that we can do. There's little examples of it, but to really get it to the scale that's meaningful against the threat, we have to get more cutters into the theater.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'm going to have a second round of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would prohibit drag shows and drag queen story hours at U.S. military bases and installations. This measure is essential to ensure that our military remains focused on core mission. President Biden and his Department of Defense have hosted multiple drag show events as the left continues to push a sexual agenda on service members, showing total disregard for our troops who signed up to protect this country, not to be subjected to far-left policies. This agenda doesn't stop at our men and women in uniform. The Biden administration is also targeting young children in an effort to spread its views, its sexual agenda. In 2022, a military base in Virginia hosted a kid-friendly diversity, equity, inclusion summer festival, and I use air quotes, kid-friendly, featuring Harpy Daniels, the Navy drag queen, where children were encouraged to attend. That same summer, another base scheduled a drag queen story hour for children. Our country depends on a lethal military capable of rising to any occasion, just as the Allied forces did 80 years ago when they stormed the beaches of Normandy. They exemplified patriotism and courage. It seems the Biden administration and its DOD is more focused on promoting drag queens waving the rainbow flag in a cultural war, preparing them for the cultural battle versus preparing a real fighting force, advancing the red, white, and blue on a real battlefield. This is nothing short of an insult to our troops. It's a mockery to history and those who died fighting for this country. What would General Eisenhower, what would General MacArthur say? I believe they would encourage a return to thousands of years of history of societal norms, not the current sexual fad that is in tandem with our armed services not being able to meet their recruitment goals, being down 30% during the Biden administration. Young men who make up the bulk of our fighting forces are inspired by G.I. Joe. They are not inspired by be a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Although the DOD indicated it would stop hosting drag queen events last year, this informal decision lacks the force of law and was only made after significant public backlash. We have every reason to believe the DOD would resume these events tomorrow if they felt they could get away with it. We should codify this and not give them that option. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oklahoma reserves. Is there someone in opposition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the LGBTQ families, gay people who serve in our country, and frankly, anyone who just likes to have fun, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. Now, we know there are a lot of threats to the health and well-being of our service members. Poisoned water on military bases, toxic mold in military housing, PTSD, and suicide. So I'm stunned to see that a top Republican idea to protect our troops is actually to ban drag shows. Now, Mr. Speaker, my Republican colleagues want us to believe that gays are trying to murder us. They want to believe that drag is harmful or immoral or wrong. This is completely ridiculous. Now, I hate to break it to my Republican colleagues, but LGBTQ people have fought and died for this country since the American Revolution, even if they were forced to hide their true selves. We can document and celebrate drag shows on military bases, and they've been celebrated since the 1800s and through both world wars. The USO and Red Cross hosted drag shows during World War II. The army that defeated Hitler and saved the world included drag queens. Ronald Reagan starred in a movie called This Is the Army, a movie about World War II that featured 4 drag performances. And he's not the only Republican president who knew that drag can be fun and sometimes silly. Mr. Speaker, drag is art, drag is culture, and drag is a form of comedy. And drag is not a crime, and it's not pornography. Now, real obscenity is when one of our colleagues, the gentlewoman from Georgia, shows literal photos of revenge porn in our oversight committee. So if we want to end porn in government facilities, let's ban that. We know that inclusion in our military is good for our country. We want to welcome anyone who wants to serve. And I'd invite my Republican colleagues to join me at a drag show in the future. You'll see that drag is not a threat to anyone. And I'm convinced that some of you would really enjoy it. It's my deep concern that this amendment is legitimizing an extremist narrative that drag performances are somehow harmful or threatening. Drag is art. So, Mr. Speaker, this amendment should sashay away. I receive my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, this amendment simply codifies what the DOD stated last year, that, quote, holding these type of events in federally funded facilities is not suitable use of DOD resources, end of quote. I would like to remind my colleagues that the language in this amendment passed in last year's NDAA, which almost all Republicans and some Democrats voted for, Americans' tax dollars should not be paying or being used to prop up paying for men to dress up as women in sexualized performances. I take exception to the comment that this is something that was occurring during the greatest generation. What may be referenced is something totally different than something now that is designed to sexualize this culture. With that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Yeah, I just want to remind my colleagues that art should be celebrated in this country. There are all forms of art, or whether someone's going to a live theater performance, whether they're seeing something in a gallery, whether they're enjoying a sculpture, whether they're seeing a live music performance, or whether they're seeing a drag show. It is all a form of art. It's also an American art form that has been around our country for hundreds of years and has been on military bases since the USO was performing these similar types of shows. And so I want to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman is the only member with time remaining. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, this amendment is a culture war stunt that does nothing to make our troops safer. It politicizes our military and silences service. Look, I think first of all, let's be very clear. What you saw tonight was a clear contrast between a good man that we believe in, that is going to win re-election, and a con man, a criminal, and a traitor to this country. Let's also be very clear. Donald Trump tonight doubled down on his anti-immigrant rhetoric in the debate. He called somehow that immigrants are creating a rat nest in this country, that we're an uncivilized country because you bring immigrants in. That is offensive to the Latino community and to immigrants who have helped build the United States. As an immigrant myself, I'm disgusted at his rhetoric tonight. He's the most anti-Latino president that we have had in decades. And one other thing, he also tonight lied again, especially about COVID and the pandemic. I lost 2 parents to the pandemic. One was actually a healthcare worker, my mother. And Donald Trump stood up there and lied about the pandemic while he was telling people to inject bleach, to not take the vaccine, and cause more harm to this country when he was president than any president that we have seen. So Joe Biden tonight did what he needed to do, which was deliver a message about substance. We're proud of him, and we're going to win in November.
Great. And finally, Mr. Garcia, do you have confidence? Do you have confidence as Biden as your party's nominee?
Absolutely. He's been done a great job as president. He has delivered for the American people over and over again. And the election's going to be a binary choice. It's going to be between the president and a convicted felon who attacked the Capitol. And so I think voters will have a choice.
But do you think the voters recognize that after that stumbling performance last night?
Look, I get that President Biden had a sore throat, apparently was not feeling well. But at the end of the day, we've seen the president in action for years. We know what he's like. And I think 20 minutes of a debate, half an hour of a debate, where he did obviously have some sort of throat challenge or perhaps was sick, I don't think it's going to matter at the end of the day.
You don't think you'd be better off with a better candidate?
Absolutely not. There's one person in this country that has defeated Donald Trump, and his name is Joe Biden. And so the one person that can beat Donald Trump again is a person that already beat him. And let's be really clear about the president's record. The president has lowered the cost of health care. He is protecting abortion rights and fighting for abortion rights across this country. He's making sure that we're expanding infrastructure. And so he actually has a record to run on. And the truth is that voters are going to have a choice. And then you have Donald Trump, who, by the way, couldn't say one factual thing in the entire debate. The entire debate, all he did was lie after lie after lie after lie.
But Congressman, if the
So
president
I think it's clear.
If the president can't articulate that record, isn't that a problem for you? And the voters
Look, let's be really clear. I think what we had last night was an issue of maybe style and substance. But on the substance, the president articulated his message very clearly. He talked about issues around infrastructure, around ensuring that the insulin costs, the work he's done there. He talked about defending Roe and defending natural access to abortion, and he took on Donald Trump for the attack on the Capitol. So he was very clear, maybe with a little bit of a sore throat, but he was very clear about his message last night. And I was proud of Joe Biden. Joe Biden has always been there for us. This party was going to stay united behind the president. He is going to be our nominee, and we're going to defeat Donald Trump.
So you want to stand as the nominee?
100%. There's nobody I would rather have as their nominee than Joe Biden.
Mr. Garcia, do you have confidence? Do you have confidence as Biden as your party's nominee?
Absolutely. He's been done a great job as president. He has delivered for the American people over and over again. And the election's going to be a binary choice. It's going to be between the president and a convicted felon who attacked the Capitol. And so I think voters will have a choice.
But do you think the voters recognize that after that stumbling performance last night?
Look, I get that President Biden had a sore throat, apparently was not feeling well. But at the end of the day, we've seen the president in action for years. We know what he's like. And I think 20 minutes of a debate, half an hour of a debate, where he did obviously have some sort of throat challenge or perhaps was sick, I don't think it's going to matter at the end of the day.
You don't think you'd be better off with a better candidate?
Absolutely not. There's one person in this country that has defeated Donald Trump, and his name is Joe Biden. And so the one person that can beat Donald Trump again is a person that already beat him. And let's be really clear about the president's record. The president has lowered the cost of health care. He is protecting abortion rights and fighting for abortion rights across this country. He's making sure that we're expanding infrastructure. And so he actually has a record to run on. And the truth is that voters are going to have a choice. And then you have Donald Trump, who, by the way, couldn't say one factual thing in the entire debate. The entire debate, all he did was lie after lie after lie after lie.
But Congressman, if the
So
president
I think it's clear.
If the president can't articulate that record, isn't that a problem for you? And the voters
Look, let's be really clear. I think what we had last night was an issue of maybe style and substance. But on the substance, the president articulated his very important point. And actually, personally, I've co-sponsored numerous bills before the Congress that look at banning individual stocks for 4 members of Congress. I strongly believe in that. But can you talk a little bit more about how these conflicts of interest can weaken our oversight into some of the department's more troubled programs?
Sure. Thank you. And I agree that members of Congress, as well as other officials in the government, including officials at the Department of Defense, holding direct financial stakes in defense companies is problematic at best. I mean, at the very least, it creates the appearance of potential corruption and the appearance of impropriety, even if there is no actual or real corruption or impropriety. It just looks really bad and feeds into an already pretty large and metastasizing feeling of lack of trust on the part of the public. And we don't want to make that any worse than it already is. But to be more precise in answering your question, I think it is just a truism that if your financial bottom line is tethered or tied to the performance of an individual company or an industry more broadly, there is a natural human inclination toward wanting to do what you can to increase your own financial standing. And if you happen to be in a position of extraordinary power, there are 535 people in the United States Congress who have that extraordinary power, and they have access to information and insight that we, as the rest of the public, do not have. You can see why there's a huge conflict of interest there. Again, I just want to stress, even if we don't have a smoking gun causal link between one member of Congress's vote and their financial portfolio, or one member of Congress's announcement of an investigation or oversight activity and their financial portfolio, we can see how it looks really bad and it creates bad optics. And so anything we can do to mitigate conflicts of interest, real or perceived, is going to be a good thing overall. And it isn't just Congress, as I mentioned. There are folks at the Department of Defense who are invested in the defense industry despite having real power to make real decisions that would impact the defense industry, impact individual companies, and also impact their own financial portfolios.
Thank you. I also want to just return briefly to the contractor price gouging issue. We know there are two problems here. First is we rely on these single source suppliers, and also that we also have a system where larger companies can come in and buy in small suppliers and, of course, raise prices while evading regulations and safeguards. We know that this is a core problem. We all want to make it easier to do business with DoD, especially for small businesses. Now, I know oftentimes we talk about cutting the red tape, but sometimes red tape is actually oversight. I know this should be true just through my work as mayor of my former city. We had a fairly good-sized city, $2 billion budget, over 6,000 employees. So oftentimes, when folks had cut the red tape, we would come back with, well, we'd like to as well, but we also want to make sure that we're not wastefully spending resources within our city departments. Again, can you talk, Mr. Hiller-Goddard, about how we can make sure that our regulations on contractors are most effective?
Sure. Well, there's an old expression that I believe it goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I think we need to operationalize that principle here when it comes to contracting. The more we can do to upfront provide Department of Defense officials, specifically contracting and procurement officers, with the really pertinent and relevant information they need, specifically around cost and price, the more upfront, upstream mechanisms we can have to make sure that contracts, are fair and reasonable, the prices and the terms therein are fair and reasonable, and that the American taxpayer is receiving a good deal. The more we can do on the front end, the better, because it's very hard to fix these problems in a post hoc sort of retroactive way. So that's why those upfront mechanisms are so important, and they are just basic due diligence. So I referenced in my opening statement the Truth in Negotiations Act, or TINA. Now, TINA, wouldn't say it's the only mechanism, but it's one of the primary mechanisms we have for ensuring that cost and price information is provided when it should be provided at the outset of contract negotiations. But because of the sort of changing thresholds, changing thresholds and standards that apply in TINA when someone has to provide that cost and price information, we've seen the law get watered down, and it hasn't been as effective as it could be over the years. So one thing we would certainly advocate and propose is a restoration of reporting thresholds under TINA, and perhaps even a strengthening and a tightening of those up front. That way we're ensuring integrity at the front end of the process, as opposed to trying to recoup money at the back end of the process if we run into malfeasance or price gouging.
Thank you. I just want to conclude, I appreciate that. I just want to conclude by saying that we also have a lot of work to do on national security, particularly intelligence estimates right now in the war in Ukraine. Russia is producing almost 3 times more artillery munitions in the U.S. and Europe, and we know they can do it at a lower cost. So this conversation is a serious conversation about national security, the security of our Ukrainian allies, and I hope we can continue to looking at this very serious issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. I appreciate
you. Thank you. We all remember We all remember the world in 2020, where we were, and for some of us, who we lost. Now, I was in my second term as mayor of Long Beach, California. And my mom was a healthcare worker. Like many of you, I watched in terror and horror as the COVID pandemic consumed our lives. As mayor, I fought for more hospital beds, for more tests, and to make masks more accessible. What we needed at that moment was national leadership. But instead, we got Donald Trump. While schools closed and dead bodies filled morgues, Donald Trump downplayed the virus. He told us to inject bleach into our bodies. He peddled conspiracy theories across the country. We lost hundreds of thousands of Americans and our economy collapsed. Now, that summer of 2020, my mom and my stepfather both died of the COVID pandemic. And I miss them every single day. So when Donald Trump and his MAGA extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene downplay the horror of the pandemic, it should make us all furious. Now, I will never forget when Kamala Harris called me after my parents died. She told me about her own story, about losing her own mother, and that she was praying for me at that very moment. Now, we all know that later that year, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected president and vice president. And what a difference they made together. They got people vaccinated. They got the virus under control. They safely reopened our schools. And they passed the American Rescue Plan. A historic economic package that helped small businesses and created jobs all across the country. Thank you, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Now, I am a proud immigrant who came to the United States as a young child. We grew up poor. English was our second language, and we often, like many immigrant families, struggled to get by. But my mom, she moved here to the United States because she believed in the American dream. I'll never forget the day that I became a United States citizen. I raised my right hand and I pledged an oath to protect and to love this country. It was the proudest day of my life. My mom taught me to love this country. She taught me that real American patriotism is not about screaming and yelling America first. Real American patriotism is loving your country so much that you want to help the people in your country. That is American patriotism. And we all know that Kamala Harris understands and knows this as well. Kamala Harris is ready to lead this country. We can all remember 2020. We can all remember the horrors of Donald Trump. But let's remember, most importantly, tonight and every single day this week, that we are not going back. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're obviously here this week to talk about Vice President Harris's vision for the future, and a vision that really focuses and centers Americans and the fundamental freedoms that all Americans care about every single day. And I think what you're also going to see moving forward in tonight is the clear contrast between the Harris-Walz ticket and the backwards-looking Donald Trump with what is now an incredibly unpopular vice presidential pick in J.D. Vance. In fact, the most unpopular VP pick in history. Every time we turn around, we see Vance attacking women, the rights of families, moving back freedoms, ranting about magazine covers that Donald Trump just did about Vice President Harris. We're getting not just weirdness as we see, but a complete just chaotic campaign, a chaotic message. All they're talking about are abortion bans and moving the country backwards. Now, just yesterday, Trump has said he had no regrets about ripping away the reproductive rights of women across the country. That is the kind of message that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are promoting every single day across this country. And as we can see, America is not having it. What's really important to remind us, and we reminded folks of this yesterday and will again tonight, is that Trump is totally unfit for the White House and for the job. He left the worst jobs record since Herbert Hoover. He turned infrastructure week into a punchline. And of course, his failures we saw over and over again displayed, not just last night, but we will do that again today. So why would the American public want to go back to that again? Today, Donald Trump talks about his Project 2025 agenda. That was highlighted yesterday. It will be highlighted throughout the week. He wants to raise middle-class costs by $3,900 a year. He wants to ban abortion nationwide. He wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. He wants to fire civil servants and destroy the government as we know it today. Now, we know that just earlier, a few months ago, we saw Google searches for Project 2025 surpass even searches for Taylor Swift. So voters are really turning on and tuning in to Project 2025, and you saw that yesterday, and you'll see that continued. And of course, we have Vice President Harris, who is fighting for the American people, who knows what this is all about, which is making people's lives better, and that will be highlighted tonight. Donald Trump, let's be crystal clear, is a convicted felon who wants to make everyone's life worse and only cares about himself and his billionaire friends. So make no mistake, heading into November, we know still to this day that we are the underdog campaign. We are not taking any single day for granted. We're knocking on doors and making phone calls every single day, and we're very clear about what the mission is ahead, and that's what tonight is going to be about. And don't forget, this is a week also of contrasts. It's a convicted felon versus a prosecutor who wants to move us forward. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Michael.
Probably one more over here. Thank you so much. So this actually is not about the convention, but Congressman Garcia, I was wondering, there's a lot of focus on passage of the Equality Act with the Democratic victory in November. Are there other LGBTQ legislative priorities that would be a focus for you with the Democratic victory in November?
Sure. I mean, a couple of things. I think let's first remember that the Biden-Harris administration has been the most pro-LGBTQ plus administration in history, and Vice President Harris is a big part of that. I don't think we've ever had a presidential candidate who understands the LGBTQ plus community or has advocated for that community as much as Vice President Harris. When she was DA in the Bay Area, she was one of the first people in the country to marry same-sex couples and started that whole revolution across the country. And so what we have is an incredible advocate and friend as a candidate. Obviously, the Equality Act, she has said herself, is the top legislative priority. She's spoken to it many times, but I also believe that her administration will be reflective of the diversity of this country, including within the LGBTQ plus community, and also to have someone that is not attacking LGBTQ plus people every single day, like Donald Trump is, who has been incredibly homophobic and has been incredibly, I think, shameful in his attacks on the community, I think will be really important. And so I think you're going to see not just the Equality Act, but to be support of ensuring that we're not banning books and that we're not doing horrible things to attack the community.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Counterterrorism, of course, is critical to the Department of Homeland Security. It's important, I know, to everybody that's here. And we know that border security is an important part of that tool. Our security professionals are hard at work, which we have seen, of course, in recent arrests, and our committee should also support that work. I also know that we shouldn't distort national security threats to score political points. Hopefully no one is interested in that. But there's so many other types of extremism and other types of major security threats we should be focused on, whether it's mass shootings, domestic extremism, which should be looked at by this committee. We often, over and over again, including in this committee, continue to demonize immigrants, continue to somehow put all of our criminal issues on the backs of immigrants, folks like my family, folks like myself. And we should be very clear about actually what's happening in this country and actually looking at the data as it relates to immigrants and crime. And if we're being honest with each other, we can see that immigrants are contributing to this country and not causing these kinds of exaggerations that my colleagues here on this committee are saying. I want to start with an important data point over here, if I can just share this really quick. So, Mr. Norris, here we have a chart of the annual homicide rate going back for the last few decades. You can see it's pretty clear. This is all the way from the 1960s all the way till today. Now, looking at this, and this is data collected by police departments and the FBI and others, do you agree that the country is safer today as it relates to homicides than in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to point out the immigrant population is substantially higher today, too.
Thank you. And I want to point out that if you look at this, clearly, we are safer today than we have ever been over the last few decades. I do want to point out, though, in the year 2020, we do see a dramatic spike. Do you see the spike there over here, right around the year 2020?
Yes.
Great. And who was actually the president in 2020?
Donald Trump was the president of the United States in 2020.
So the largest spike that we see in actual homicides over the last few decades is a year that Donald Trump was actually the president of the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is it true that under Donald Trump, murder rates surged by 30% to the highest rate since the late 90s?
There was a very large surge in the last year of his administration.
Right, so here we have crime rates are going down, homicide rates are up here in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. They start to decrease, and then we see the one spike when Donald Trump was president. Then, of course, as we go into 2021, who then got elected president then?
Joe Biden was elected.
And since that time, if you look at this chart, is violent crime starting then to decrease or increase once Joe Biden became the president?
It started to decrease from the elevated level that it was.
Thank you. So it's important to note here that now crime is beginning to decrease. Now, the Major City Chiefs Association, which represents the 60 major city police departments in America, including Long Beach, where I was mayor, honored to have served and to help lead. We had over 700 police officers, which an incredible group of men and women. Through this period of time in 2024 and 2023, we have actually seen a drop in murders and killings, not just back home in California, but across the country. So as we can see in this chart, homicides have plummeted, and we know they continue to plummet. I think it's important that we take the word of our police officers and their data, what they're presenting, over what Donald Trump is saying. And I want to show you one other chart, which also is important. Now, again, sir, is it true that the incarceration rate for both documented and even undocumented immigrants is far below the rate for native-born citizen Americans?
Yes, it is.
So today, immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated than all other U.S.-born individuals. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, I only say this because, as you can see, native-born Americans are actually committing crimes and then going to jail at a higher rate than the immigrant population. And I say that not because we should want folks in jail. Everyone should be accountable to the law. But this idea that immigrants are somehow are causing more crime or filling up our prisons more or committing and creating more chaos across this country is actually not true when you look at the data. And so I think it's very important that we call out the lies and the untruths that are happening from folks that are running for president, and quite frankly, also from folks that are on this committee. We know that undocumented people People that are here, that are legal immigrants, are actually committing less crimes when you look at the total number. And so I wanted to make those points and make sure that we're talking about facts. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to warn the American people about one of the greatest threats we face as a country. A shadowy network led by a billionaire businessman is working to threaten some of our most important values. This businessman attacks immigrants from far places and mild-mannered journalists here in our country. And the shadowy network seeks power at all costs. And no, I'm not talking about Lex Luthor and his Legion of Doom, but Donald Trump and his authoritarian and dictator friends who threaten our very democracy and world peace. I'm here to raise the alarm about the massive foreign interference of our politics at the highest levels. We know that recently the Washington Post reported allegations that the Egyptian president, seen right here, may have tried to transfer $10 million to the Donald Trump campaign for president in 2016. And we also know that other foreign governments have also tried to buy influence from the Trumps and the Kushner family. We know that Jared Kushner colluded to collect $2 billion from the Saudi royal family for his investment fund just 2 months after leaving the White House job. We also know the Trump Organization has collected at a minimum $7.8 million in foreign payments from multiple countries during his presidency, funneled through the Trump Organization and its hotel properties. Mr. Speaker, we cannot delay more accountability or an investigation. Donald Trump has made dangerous allegiances with enemies of the United States of America and our allies. They do not stand for truth, justice, and the American way. I have raised this alarm over and over and over again, and we should not stop. Thank you, and I yield back.
The chair would remind...
Chairman yields back. Gentleman now, Chair now recognizes Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. We've been talking a lot about the Biden-Harris record. It's, I think, important to note that we're doing this hearing likely because the debate was such a disaster for Donald Trump and for the House majority. Now, I was actually there in Philly. It was embarrassing to watch. Donald Trump admitted, of course, to terminating Roe v. Wade. He attacked reproductive freedoms. He wants to kill the Affordable Care Act and spread misinformation about immigrants eating cats and dogs. And I just also want to remind folks that we've been talking a lot about Project 2025, of which many witnesses know a lot about, and which Donald Trump said contains many good ideas. But it's not just Project 2025. Donald Trump has already been the president, and I thought it was also important at this moment to review his record. Let's start with some of the facts about Donald Trump. Donald Trump, first and foremost, had the worst jobs presidency since World War II and maybe American history. The worst jobs record since World War II and maybe American history. He lost 4.9 million American jobs. He added 4.8 trillion to the debt, even without the COVID-related spending. Now, cities and communities like mine were facing disaster. State and local governments were looking at service cuts. Schools, vital programs were all being looked at being cut. By contrast, if we're talking about the Biden-Harris record, 15.4 million jobs were added during the Biden-Harris administration. And the Project 2025 agenda, we know, will raise a sales tax on everything we buy, and economists think it will cost the American family an average of $1,700 per year and would cost 600,000 American jobs and could even cause a recession. But it's not just the economic destruction. Let's talk about his COVID mismanagement. We lost 1.3 million American lives, a disaster under Donald Trump. He asked people that we could combat the virus by injecting disinfectant into people's bodies. He failed to get PPE out the door. He picked fights with governors rather than uniting the country. We were on our own, and Donald Trump should own his failures with the pandemic. But let's look at the rest of the Trump record. He destroyed Roe v. Wade as the third thing on this bullet point. He brags about the extremist Supreme Court and turning back Roe v. Wade. Just this week, ProPublica documented a heartbreaking case where a Georgia woman waited for 20 hours after doctors refused to perform a routine procedure. She passed away. Her death was preventable. But Donald Trump is putting these state abortion bans in place through his judges and the legislatures all across the country. But let's talk about family separation, because it doesn't just end there. His record attacking immigrants like myself and my family is also shameful. He's promising the most extreme mass deportations in the country, going door to door to arrest our neighbors and friends. He believes that immigrants poison the blood of his country, his quote, not mine. And of course, let's remember he just, at the debate, he kept talking about somehow immigrants, Haitian immigrants, are eating pets in Ohio, and we know that's not true. This country and the world should be united against this type of rhetoric and this record. We all want a secure border, but Donald Trump has shown us time and time again through his record and his future agenda, the Project 2025 agenda, that he has zero respect for immigrants and for the Latino community. But I want to also end with January 6th. Donald Trump betrayed his oath of office when he provoked an attack on this Capitol and an insurrection on January the 6th. Project 2025 shows how we will continue to threaten our institutions and our democracy. The Trump administration was a disaster, and you don't need to take my word for it. Why we're talking about the Biden-Harris record, when it fixed the COVID crisis, when jobs are up, when unemployment is down, and not focus on the destruction of Donald Trump, is clearly because this is, again, another political committee hearing. And let's look at what others have said. Vice President Mike Pence, former Attorney General Bill Barr, former Defense Secretaries Jim Mattis and Mark Esper, former National Security Advisors H.R. McMaster and John Bolton, former Chief of Staff like John Kelly. All of these folks believe that Donald Trump is unfit to serve as president, that he's failed his country and the Constitution. We cannot go back. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen yield back.
Gentlemen yield.
Chair. Oh, I was asking for the time. Is that okay? Thank you. But I just wonder on that point whether any of the witnesses would comment on this unprecedented defection of former Trump officials from supporting him. And anybody, who was on the Project 2025 side wants to weigh in on that, or Ms. Perryman, what you say about Vice President Pence and these former cabinet officials who've abandoned Donald Trump. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think President Trump has spoken explicitly about the majority of these people were either running against him in the case of Vice President Pence, or they lost their job because—
Well, Pence wasn't running against him when
the
mob came in chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." He ran with Donald Trump.
Many of the people who Mr. Garcia referenced are people who were let go because they failed to fulfill the vision that President Trump had painted.
Oh, so
for
I
the
see.
American
There's nothing
people
wrong
and
with
that
what
they
Donald
had
Trump did. You're blaming it on these people.
Gentlemen's time's expired.
I'm just
Before
saying
I
they're more
recognize Ms.
like
Mays,
great
yes,
fire
before
employees.
Yeah.
Competing with China, and that's unfortunate. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I ran over.
You're there. Chair, good question. Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Clearly, China is our leading geopolitical challenge and a complicated one because obviously they're also our largest trading partner. And I think one thing that's bipartisan is no one doesn't think that China isn't our most strategic challenge. And certainly we all understand the gravity of China and competition as it relates to our own economy and our own national security interests. I know that we talked a lot about Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump today. I believe that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have united our allies against aggressive authoritarian states. But I also think it's important, since we've talked so much about Trump and the Trump era, to compare the Biden-Harris record with the Donald Trump record as it relates to China. And of course, we here have a recent a story by the Washington Post. I'm going to show a recent one as well about President Xi and China and John Bolton's claims, which I think are very credible, that somehow Donald Trump is working and had worked with President Xi to actually encourage election interference. Now, during a one-on-one meeting between President Xi and Trump, Donald Trump asked to buy more soybeans and wheat to help him actually win re-election, as John Bolton had noted and the Washington Post reported. And in fact, in that same meeting, Trump actually said that Democrats were the party that was actually tougher on China. Now, Mr. Stokes, does this sound to you like Trump was pursuing some type of electoral gain and putting it above the national security interest?
I wasn't in the room, so I can't speak to what was or wasn't said. I think in general, we shouldn't have any hostile foreign states or any foreign states interfering in U.S. elections, period, full stop, no matter if they're supporting Democrats or Republicans.
And of course, and if Donald Trump, though, was encouraging election interference, that would be highly obviously unethical and illegal as far as I'm concerned. But we know that Donald Trump has also used the power of the presidency for his own political gain before. Now, Mr. Stokes, can you remind us why President Trump was actually impeached the very first time he was impeached?
This isn't my area of expertise, but presumably Russ's influence in the election.
Thank you. And it's also true, if we remember, that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, received $2 billion from Saudi Arabia for his investment fund after leaving the White House, just 2 months after leaving the White House. And these allegations of foreign interference of Donald Trump, his relationship with China, I think should be very concerning. Now, I want to show you this photo right here. There's been recent reports, again in the Washington Post, and Ranking Member Raskin and I have asked actually for an investigation into allegations that the Egyptian government may have sent $10 million in campaign contributions to Donald Trump in the closing days of the Trump campaign. And this raises serious questions, of course, about what Donald Trump has done, whether it's been his meetings with President Xi, whether it's been his conversations with the Egyptian president, and others, of which he was impeached for the first time, as to why he's trying to gain favors around elections. Donald Trump, of course, is resisting this investigation. But, Mr. Stokes, do you think that the American people should be concerned about potential quid pro quos?
Yes, from any presidential candidate or former president.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about one other. We know that President Donald Trump also received at least $7.8 million from at least 20 foreign states and authoritarian leaders, including China, of which we're talking about today, in blatant violation of the Constitution. And I think it's important to remember that that $7.8 million is just the minimum that we know about, because we have a very limited number of the actual receipts of money that was going into the Trump organization, including money that was coming in directly from China. So as we're talking about the Chinese government and the Chinese influence, we have to ensure that we note the influence that China and other foreign actors were having on Donald Trump. So with that, I'm going to yield back and remind us that that's the investigation that we should be having.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
But I just wonder, Dr. Thayer, you've made a very strong argument that the Trump administration confronted China, and yet there's all of this evidence that Donald Trump and his businesses were pocketing millions of dollars from the Chinese government, the dozens of trademarks that went to his daughter, his lavish praise of President Xi. And I just wonder how you reconcile that in your mind. Is there any cognitive dissonance there, or are you saying that the administration did one thing and then the president was sort of a loose cannon off doing his own?
Well, Ranking Member Raskin, thank you for the comment. My thoughts are these. First, that the threat from the Chinese Communist Party should be a nonpartisan issue, in that the CCP is killing Americans every day. Over last year, the CDC said 107,000 Americans were killed by fentanyl overdoses, precursor chemicals being...
I got you out on that stuff. I guess my question is about elite capture.
And gentlemen's time expired.
Yeah, I mean, was the elite capture strategy targeted at Donald Trump, but you're saying his administration somehow survived it?
I don't know that that's what he said, but gentlemen's time's expired. Chair recognizes Ms. McClain from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The CCP is clearly not our friend. Let me repeat, the Chinese Communist Party...
Already heard today, but also it's important to clear up the facts about some of the data that's being used that I believe is actually incorrect, and I think that the facts make it clear. I do want to start with this chart, and Mr. Isaacson, you presented some charts in your testimony. I want to use this one as well. So if we look at this chart, this is actually a chart that's often used by my Republican colleagues. Donald Trump uses this chart. It's pretty famous, and it shows the migration spike here over time. But the truth is that this chart is actually factually incorrect, and I think it's important to note and to point out how incorrect it actually is. First, it says that Trump left office in April 2020, right here, when migration was actually at its lowest point. We know that's actually not true. Can you actually tell us what happened in 2020 and why was there a huge decline at this point in the chart?
Sure. I mean, all of the world's borders closed everywhere in March of 2020.
Because of the COVID pandemic.
Exactly.
Right, except the Republicans who have used this chart over and over again, including in other committees, keep saying that's when Trump left office. Now, when did Trump actually leave office?
January of 2021.
That's right. And January of 2021 is actually right here. Mm-hmm. So I'll add an arrow to that.
Ooh, arrows.
So if you look at this chart, from here to here was all of during Donald Trump's presidency. So the increase in border crossings and the spike that you see beginning to happen actually happened when who was president?
That's right. Things are already going up, a lot of single adults, and then just after that, the world's borders really start opening.
That's right. And so obviously, the border crossings start increasing. Joe Biden then becomes president. And then something else happens that's missing in this chart. We had the bipartisan border deal. And then, as we know, border crossings actually begin to decrease. So I'm going to add actually where we are today. This is actually where we are today with these illegal border crossings. And so I think it's important that we actually stick to facts. This is incorrect. When Donald Trump actually left office, what was actually happening in 2020, and the addition to this chart, which is actually where border crossings are today, an issue solved by the Biden-Harris administration, just to be very, very clear. And Mr. Isaacson, I also want to note that we've discussed contributions of migrants, contributions of crime, and I think it's important that we know, yes, Donald Trump killed the bipartisan Border Patrol deal. We know that. And there's also been attacks on immigrants that somehow where there's some sort of crime wave that immigrants are causing. Right. I also want to use this chart. This chart, by the way, is compiled by data by the men and women in our local police departments across America. So police actually submit this information. Now, let me ask you, do you agree that the country's safer than it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Yes, it absolutely is.
Right, because this is actually our crime trends and actual homicide rates in the U.S., and this is where we actually are today. I do see a spike in crime, actually, in 2020, right over here. Who was president when that dramatic spike happened?
Donald Trump, but also COVID, yeah.
Right, but Donald Trump was president, exactly. And Donald Trump, actually, murder rates surged by 30% to the highest rate since the 90s, correct?
That's right.
Now, in 2021, when Joe Biden became president, violent crime rates have now begun to decrease. So I just want to point out also that when we talk about migrants, we're talking about what the impacts to national crime rate is, that crime has actually plummeted this year, and the Biden-Harris administration has actually made the country safer. And so we've invested in community policing, and again, they understand that immigrants can contribute to this country. But just to connect back to the border, do you see any correlation between the crime rate in this chart and trends in migration over the last decades?
No, I see no correlation at all.
Is it safe to say that migration does not bring crime to our country? Would you agree with that?
No, the studies I've seen show that the migrant population commits crime at a lower rate than the U.S.
And in fact, also, when you look at studies of migration, we know that migrants actually cause less crimes than natural-born citizens. That's also correct. Is that also true?
Yeah, I mean, of course, migrants do commit some crimes, but the rate is lower.
And if you commit a crime, you should be held accountable to that crime, of course, and we know that's also critically important. So I just want to thank you because I think facts matter. They're important. This is a nation of immigrants, and I think it's important to actually stick to the data and the facts. And with that, I yield back. For being here. I think that obviously all folks in Congress, Republicans, Democrats, want a safe and secure border. I think what we have are different approaches to how we treat immigrants, a humane system, and ensuring that we don't go back to a process that was inhumane to people that are oftentimes struggling and just seeking a better life. We don't want to go back to family separation, to Muslim bans, to undermining our asylum system, and we know we can achieve a comprehensive goal that both has a secure border, but also a plan for immigrants that are here in this country and that are working hard to contribute to our economy and to our country. Now, legal pathways to ensure an orderly and humane process are important. Now, I strongly support legal immigration because we are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants are some of the most patriotic people I know in our country. They make our community stronger, they work hard, they build our country. I'm an immigrant. I came to this country as a young child. I love America. I think it's the best country on earth. When I raised my right hand, it was the proudest day of my life, and I'm giving back to this country. I try to every single day. And the same is true for everyone in my family who are also immigrants. But I also want to be clear why I think we're here today. It's because some folks in Congress, and certainly Donald Trump, think that bashing immigrants will win this election. Now, 2 weeks ago, during what was a bizarre debate performance, we saw, of course, the former president repeat manufactured conspiracies about immigrants, and in this case, Haitian immigrants in Ohio. As we now remember his horrible quote, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live here, and this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame. Now, we know that's been completely debunked. The Republican governor of Ohio, the Republican mayor of the city manager, and now even the woman that first made the claim, who's also a Trump supporter in Springfield, all have said that this was not true. Yet the lie continues to be repeated. J.D. Vance and other members of Congress have continued to amplify this xenophobic lie, and it's a shame. And we know it gets worse. We know that Haitian immigrants in Springfield also are overwhelmingly there on legal work permits. They're actually there legally, and were invited by the state and the city to work. But that hasn't stopped J.D. Vance and Donald Trump from threatening to revoke their status and to allow a mass deportation agenda. Now, Donald Trump's rhetoric has been dividing us and stoking anti-immigrant hate, I believe, since he first came down that escalator in 2015 to announce that he thought Mexicans were rapists and murderers. And he says families like mine and other immigrants are poisoning the blood of this country. Those are the facts. Now, I'm glad to say that the American people, however, don't buy that. A CBS poll found that only 1/3 of voters approve of Trump's claims about immigrants, and almost 65% believe his recent claims are false, which we know that they are. But here are some more facts. Donald Trump is not interested in border security. He killed the bipartisan border deal that was in front of the Congress, and the Biden-Harris administration has taken robust action to secure the border, and we're now seeing the results of that. And there's no immigrant crime wave, and I have to respectfully disagree with the chairman. In fact, our nation is safer today and has less crime today than it did when Donald Trump left office. Those are the facts being reported by police departments across the country. And finally, I'll reiterate, I believe immigrants are inherently part of this country. They're the backbone of our country. They make our country safer, stronger, and better. With that, I yield back.
I've got to respond
Mr. Chairman,
a little bit.
I move to strike.
I'm sorry.
I move to strike to speak.
Okay, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I would be hopeful that this would not be a Trump bash-hating ordeal. But if the gentleman is going to speak, he ought to speak factually correct. The reason why the bipartisan, quote, bipartisan Senate deal was not done was because House Republicans, including myself, and at least 30 other Texans said we would not vote for it. It had absolutely nothing to do with Donald Trump. And so if the gentleman is going to make this all about politics, he at least ought to speak correctly instead of pushing falsehoods. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just do want to comment on something, and I'm disappointed that my good friend, Congressman Garcia, would try to confuse the American public. I've been down at the border 8 times. When I go down there, I frequently talk to the people who are in charge of debriefing or doing a health inspection on the new immigrants. They have told me that it is common for women who are coming across the border to be sexually assaulted. That ought to concern us all. Instead, what has happened when you try to bring up this idea that we want to stop the sexual assaults of women coming across the border, some Democrats say that this is a racial thing to say. Well, the border is to a large extent controlled by ruthless gangs. And it is very sad that the women who come here are being sexually assaulted. I don't know. Apparently you're not supposed to say it or you're going to be accused of racism. It has nothing to do with racism. Yeah. It is pointing out, including all the other problems that you have with this massive border crossing, you are having women being assaulted by the Mexican gangs south of the Rio Grande. And if you go down there and talk to the people in charge of debriefing or whatever you'd say, the people coming across, they will tell you that. So it is not a racial statement. Donald Trump cares about women and does not like to see these women who are coming here sexually assaulted.
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And first of all, this is all a point of order. I mean, this is not a part of the way the hearing procedure works. But I will just respond. I do want to ask unanimous consent, since we're having this into the record, a September 17, 2024 article from Fox News titled, "Border Patrol Apprehends 58,000 Migrants in August, down from the record 250,000 in December." And so let's be also clear that it was the bipartisan border deal, which I was discussing, that President Biden got put in, that's actually dropped migrant crossings Now we're back to historic lows because of that. And so everything I said was also factually correct. I think it's important to call out people that are also demonizing immigrants, and it's important that we stick to the facts. So I was just purely responding to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So
without objection.
if we're just going to have a discussion, I'd like to weigh in.
So are we going to go back to regular order, or?
I guess we should go back to regular order. We will go back to regular order now.
That's too bad. I wanted to weigh in, as long as everybody's weighing in, freestyle.
Big Zoyce has great things to say. Well, your time to ask questions will be coming up soon. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses today.
24, thank you.
Without objection. Andy Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's get to this thing. The Muslim ban that was mentioned. What countries were involved in the Muslim ban? Anybody know? I know. Anybody want to take a guess? I'll tell you who they were. Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and North Korea. Is North Korea a Muslim country? No, it is not. What do those countries, 6 of those 7 countries, have in common? Actually, they have in common that 4 of them were on President Obama's DHS terrorist watch list. The other 3, the other 4 were considered terrorism safe havens. Only 12% of Muslims around the world were impacted. And besides that, Mr. Clem knows this, Mr. Camerata knows this, I would hope Mr. Isaacson knows this, there were exceptions for every one of those countries to come in, so there was not an absolute ban. Another lie told by the left. How about separation? This notion of separation. More than 325,000 unaccompanied children have been misplaced by this administration, admitted to. New York Times did a study. We had the director in, and she admitted it. That's a separation. You know what these guys got criticized for? There's about 4,000 people, kids that were separated, and they found them all, but a few. These guys can't find 325,000, but you're not going to hear my colleagues say anything about it. U.S. crime rate is not down, contrary to what you say. And why do we know that? Does LAPD report? No. Does New York report? No. Does Miami-Dade report? No. Do more than 6,000 police agencies obviate any reporting? That's the correct thing. They don't report. So when you say New York is down, guess what, friend? They don't report to the FBI anymore. They don't report anymore. They stopped reporting several years ago. Why is it? They've told me it's too hard to report. And so that's what you're relying on. You know what the CBP said about Tren de Aragua? Tren de Aragua is now moving into the Northeast. And they are. But crime is down for you. That's good for you, my friend. CBP numbers, you said they're way down. I'm looking at CBP numbers right here. I'm looking at them right here. And you know what I see? I see, let's see here. August of 2023, 304,000. They're down, you're right, almost 50%. They're down to 160,000. But you know what's interesting about that? Jay Johnson, Obama's DHS secretary said, look, if you have more than 1,000 a day, you've got a crisis. Mr. Clem, is that a crisis? You've been there. How many in the last year that you were sector chief, fewer than 8,600 encounters in Yuma? Is that right?
In 2020, it was just approximately 8,800 arrests in Yuma. In 2021, it went up to 114,000. And then in 2022, it went up to 312,000. So we went up to over 1,000 a day just in Yuma alone.
Right. So if you take it, if you're standing on top of Mount Everest and you come down 1,000 feet, it may look like you've really descended a whole lot, but you ain't descended back to normal. And we're nowhere near normal. And that's the lie. That statistics that you guys are rallying around, it just blows my ever-loving mind. How about the bipartisan deal, the so-called bipartisan piece of crap deal out of the Senate? Mr. Clem, I read your statement, and what did you say? You said something like this. You said, it failed to address the border security requirements still needed by the U.S. Border Patrol. If enacted, it would codify a mandatory nationwide catch and release scheme for all populations. Anytime there is limited consequences of detention or removal, even returning to Mexico, incentivizes more people to make the dangerous journey. That dangerous journey, that's what's inhumane, is it not?
That's correct. The journey is dangerous.
And so the bill that you referred to as a better bill was H.R. 2, which has been languishing over in the Senate for over a year now. That was a bipartisan bill. That was a bill would have made significant changes along the border. Quit lying. Let me tell you, how about CBP1, the CBP1 app? How is that figured in? How's that counted in? Is that counted in your encounters between ports of entry or at the port? No, it's not counted in. And you know what? You know what those numbers are? And this will take you right back up to 2023 levels. 530,000 migrants, okay, that's the CHNV program. 813,000 came in under the CBP1. That takes you right back up to the 2023 levels, doesn't it not, Mr. Klim, Mr. Camerata? Yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
And then
Yes, if you add them together.
Yeah, and then when you throw in the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela numbers, now you're back right at maybe even a little higher than the 23 numbers. And that's the point that none of you all want to admit. You want to dance around it and you want to say, well, now they're legal. They got some kind of legal status. You know what they've got? They've got an illegal parole status, because parole under the INA is meant to be a singular, particularized parole status. But they've got categorical parole status here. And they know that's wrong, and that's where they should have stopped. And Mr. Chairman, my time's way over, but there's so much more to say here to rebut the crapola we've heard here today. Yield.
Mr. Chair, since I know time went over, can I just add one thing?
If he's adding,
if
he's adding, I'm going to add. You got time before we started. I didn't get that time.
Oh, well, that's because I'm the ranking member.
Yeah,
of the
who
committee.
cares if you're the ranking member? If you ask for a regular order, then do regular order.
Thank you, sir. As ranking member, can I, since you had more time, just one quick thing. I just want to clarify that actually the gentleman is actually incorrect. Both the states of New York and California, the city of New York City, the city of Los Angeles, do send their reports and their crime reports, and they are included in the data. And so I just think that the facts are important, and I won't.
Yeah, they are. So I demand time to respond to that.
I definitely won't correct every. I won't correct every misstatement. But I did want to correct those. Thank you.
Because if you look at the Marshall Project itself, which is not a conservative group, they will tell you. If you look at the FBI data, more than 52% of agencies don't report all of their data to FBI, and that's the facts. Facts are a stubborn thing, and doggone.
And lastly, having served as mayor for 8 years and had a police force of 600 police officers, did a great job. The city of Los Angeles, the city of New York, I can tell you, guarantee you, they report their data. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And talking about extraordinary foolish, I know that was said earlier by one of our witnesses. It's not just cities, it's counties too.
Mr. Speaker, in the past 18 months, Republicans have gathered 3.8 million documents and 80 hours of witness testimonies on a baseless inquiry against President Joe Biden. But now that Joe Biden is not running for president, they've ended their political impeachment stunt. Now, the investigation that we should be focusing on is Jared Kushner and his $2 billion from the Saudis just months after leaving the Trump White House. Now, new reporting today from the New York Times has noted that Jared Kushner collected $112 million in fees, but hasn't made a single dime for the Saudis through this fund. Now, we don't know if the Saudis expected profits or if they just wanted to reward Jared for his service. This $2 billion payment for this investment fund represents the reward of sitting next to former President Trump and pushing for pro-Saudi policies. During his time in the White House, Mr. Kushner consistently ignored the recommendations of top foreign policy experts at the State Department and even ignored the warnings of Trump's own Secretary of State. These conflicts of interest and the national security threats are obvious, but House Republicans are not interested in uncovering the truth about Kushner's actions or the suspicious actions of the Saudi government and other foreign governments. While the Senate is beginning to finally move on this investigation, the House has done nothing. Mr. Speaker, we can no longer wait to hold the Kushners accountable for their shady dealings. Our democracy is not for sale, and we need to ask ourselves the question, why did Jared Kushner receive $2 billion for an investment fund just months after leaving the White House? The American people deserve answers, and we should never stop until we get them. I yield back.
And with that, I would acknowledge Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairwoman. I want to thank the Chairwoman and the Chairman both for their continued support and really treating this discussion and these hearings in a way that's bipartisan. I think one thing that's very important for all of us that are interested in the conversation around UAPs is that this is an area that both Republicans and Democrats, where we may disagree in a lot of other spaces, this is an area where bipartisanship is really important. And in fact, I would add it's critical that we all continue to work together in a way that moves forward with the truth and important disclosure. So we're here to have a bipartisan and serious conversation, I believe, about our national security. We should always ground these conversations in facts, evidence, and the data in front of us. I want to note that we have our witnesses here, and I want to thank you all for being here, and note that also amongst you have folks that have also served us in our military. And I know that for many of you, this has been a difficult process, but I'm very grateful to have you with us today, and I thank you for joining us. I also want to note that today's hearing builds on a quite, I think, also historic public hearing that we had many months ago that Mr. Grothman and others helped lead in this very same hearing room, where I believe we began a really important public conversation about UAPs. And so I want to thank him for that, and I especially want to thank Chairwoman Mace for her continued advocacy on this topic. I also want to start with some facts. We know that there are objects or phenomena observed in our airspace, as our witnesses will testify, and also possibly in our oceans. In many cases, we don't know what they are, and this is, of course, why we're discussing UAPs. Now, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, has reported hundreds of UAPs that remain, quote, uncharacterized and unattributed, and which, quote, appear to have demonstrated unusual flight characteristics or performance capabilities and require further analysis. This is our own AARO office. Now, we shouldn't prejudge what they might be. I'm certainly not going to. We need evidence. But what we are detecting things, and we know that we don't understand them, and this is worth investigating. Now, the American people have legitimate questions, and I believe it's critical that Congress should help address them. This is about the truth and science and facts. Now, transparency and faith in our institutions is vital in a good democracy. Now, I'm proud to say that this hearing will build on that important bipartisan work, and I want to thank everyone for being involved, including members of our committee. Now, in our last hearing in July, we heard testimony that a significant number of pilots of major airlines have witnessed UAPs as well, but have no real confidential way of reporting them to the government. We heard that commercial pilots who encounter UAPs may be hesitant to speak openly due to stigma or fear of retaliation. We also know that AARO has reported that, and I want to quote, that most reports still reflect a bias towards restricted military airspace, a result of reporting from military personnel and sensors present in such areas. And so the lack of ability for civilian pilots raises real safety concerns and limits our ability to understand UAPs. This is a particular piece of this conversation that I am very interested in. Now, our last hearing inspired us to introduce the Safe Airspace for Americans Act, joined by Chairman Grothman, Chairwoman Mace, and a bipartisan group of co-sponsors. I see some of our leaders from Safe Airspace for Americans Act here, and that would create a safe reporting for UAP process, which we want to continue to do. Now, members of both parties and senior officials in multiple administrations have now taken an interest in this issue. Mainstream media, in many cases, are beginning to take more of an interest in this issue, and we should all be proud to carry that work and build confidence for the American people. I believe we can always be more transparent. To me, this hearing and others are simply about the truth and getting to the facts of what these UAPs actually are. It's very important that we show that Democrats and Republicans in Congress can work together to cut through misinformation and look for a serious and thoughtful way to have the discussion in public. Many of us have also called for additional public hearings to discuss UAPs. This should be a topic that continues on throughout the Congress so that we can gather more information, data, and work with the relevant agencies to gather more information. Finally, just want to add that those that are here on this dais, many of us have participated also in classified briefings as well, and where we have also gained a lot of important, I think, and interesting information, at least I personally have. And so with that information, we want to continue today's hearing, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here. And with that, I'd like to yield back.
Recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you to our witnesses. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member of the subcommittee for all their work, and obviously oftentimes members on this body and committee disagree. I think that it's important to recognize we lost 1.3 million Americans due to the pandemic, single largest loss of life event that we've had in the modern era. There's over 3,000 people in my own city of Long Beach died while I was the mayor, right before I got to Congress. Horrific experience to see what the pandemic did for cities and communities across the country and of course the world. Want to note a couple things as this is we're closing this committee. I think one is I'm hoping that there's two critical changes that I think are really important on the federal level, bills that I've been working on. I want to note those for all of you. I'm very concerned that still the Department of Health and Human Services does not have the same emergency buying power that the Department of Defense has. When we went through the pandemic, much of the purchasing of PPE and testing went through DoD because they have emergency power to purchase in bulk and purchase and kind of cut the red tape. That power does not exist for Health and Human Services, where I personally and many others believe is where those purchases and where that direction should be coming from. It should be coming from HHS, not from DoD, or at least it should have the same purchasing power. So that's something that we're working on. We have a bill on that. The second issue I want to note for members of the committee is we have to get to a point where we fully fund the CDC's National Wastewater Surveillance System. Can't express how important this is in preventing future pandemics. This is woefully underfunded, and we have a huge opportunity to allow and provide the CDC the resources they need to ensure that we are using this incredible resource now and being able to track viruses and pandemics in the future, and that we're funding this at its full level and not actually cutting the CDC and this program. So those are things that are very concerning to me. And I want to say one other thing which I think is important. It's my last opportunity. Dr. Tabak, I know you're with the NIH, and I just wanted you to just briefly mention what the NIH's responsibility is to prevent pandemics as this committee is working on.
So we support and conduct the research that informs the actions of my colleagues on this panel. We do long-term basic discovery to learn about viruses. We develop key infrastructure so that we can be responsive in identifying newly emergent organisms. We set up appropriate model systems to test the efficacy of potential countermeasures. We have a GMP manufacturing facility.
And Doctor, I would correct to assume that this is a completely nonpartisan organization. The work, it's essential to our nation's security and preparedness. I've met folks that I've worked with at the NIH and immense respect for the scientists, doctors, workers that are there. Would you agree it's completely a nonpartisan type of work?
Yes, we certainly are not.
Then I want to just leave us, as a final thought. I'm very, very concerned that someone that could be entrusted with our nation's health, RFK Jr., has recently said, and I quote, that he plans to have a big role in the administration as it relates to health, and has just days ago pledged to gut the NIH, firing hundreds of scientists and researchers on day one. And I'm going to show, this is from ABC News, the headline that just appeared a few days ago, which, if we're talking about pandemic preparedness, and with all due respect to the committee and the work, the fact that we're considering to bring somebody on with no scientific or medical credentials, who's falsely claimed for decades that vaccines cause autism, who has, quite frankly, said just outrageous comments about science and medicine, that this person would come in to gut the NIH, I think is shameful. I think is shameful. And Ms. Green, you can clap all you want, but it is shameful, it's dangerous, and if this committee is about pandemic prevention, we should be very concerned as a country that RFK Jr. could be put in charge of health when he is a vaccine denier and has caused great harm to the American public. I want to say just finally that I'm very concerned that someone that wants to gut the NIH, HHS, and other services could be put in charge of health of any kind in this country. And so I want to thank you, sir, for your service at the NIH and for all the witnesses that are here. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Clapp.